Hello and welcome to A-Team Group's Regtech Summit 2021 Virtual. We'd like to thank our platinum sponsors, IHS Markit, Bureau van Dijk and Moody's Analytics Company, Luxoft and Univista, our gold sponsors, ACA and the Derivatives Service Bureau, and our media partners. You can connect with your peers on the networking page, and if you have questions for the speakers, please use the panel to the right of the video. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the summit.
Hello everybody, and welcome to day 2 of this A-Team Regtech Summit Virtual. My name is Andrew Delaney. I'm Chief Content Officer at A-Team Group, and I'll be hosting the first half of today's session. We hope you enjoyed yesterday's event, and we look forward to bringing you more of the same today. Today's session will continue to explore the evolution of the regulatory environment and active areas for Regtech, such as privacy, KYC, and AML, regulatory reporting, surveillance and monitoring. And as always, today's live stream is made of keynotes, fireside chats, and panel discussions featuring industry experts who are working with and leading Regtech projects and implementations. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our speakers and sponsors for their support, expertise, and insight, and for their generosity in taking the time to join us today. Before we get going, a few housekeeping points. Please do visit the networking and sponsors section to connect with sponsors and find out how they can help you. I like to remind our audiences that it's their support that make these events possible. So I urge you to connect with them, as this will make them more likely to support future events and allow us to bring you even more valuable content. Through the networking section, you can also see who else is attending, and you can network with peers and colleagues. We also encourage you to get involved by voting in audience polls and asking questions using the Slido facility, which you'll find to the right of this video. The code for today's session is #RTSVirtual. Finally, I just wanted to update you on a few of A-Team's Regtech related activities. Hot off the press, we have the new 2021 edition of our ever popular Reg Data Handbook. That's available for free as a download from this virtual platform, so do go ahead and download that. I'd also like to urge you to sign up for Regtech Insight, which is a great source of news and commentary on all things Regtech. You can sign up no cost, so make sure you take advantage of that. We're also thrilled to announce the launch of our new channel, ESG Insight, which provides insight and commentary around regulations, data management, and technology capabilities for ESG. Very hot topic. And again, you can sign up for all of that at no cost. So do go ahead and do that. Right, so let's get on. Before we get on with the agenda, we're going to hear from our platinum sponsor, LSEG Univista. So let's hear from them now. Okay, welcome back. To kick things off today, I'm delighted to be hosting a fireside chat with Francesca Hopwood-Road, Head of Regtech and Advanced Analytics at the Financial Conduct Authority. We'll be exploring the FCA's Regtech strategy and priorities for 2022. Quick reminder to use Slido to ask us some questions. We've got Francesca here. So I'll put those questions through to Francesca as we go through the discussion. Welcome, Francesca.
Hi there, Andrew.
Good to see you. Before we begin our prepared Q&A, could you please introduce yourself, give us a bit of a feel for what your role is at the FCA?
Yeah, of course. I'm delighted to be with you and the audience this afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me. So I'm Francesca Hopwood-Road. I lead the Regtech and Advanced Analytics department at the FCA, and I've done this role for about 2.5 years. And I am the second role holder. So it's a relatively young function at the Financial Conduct Authority and has nested in amongst other services that your audience might know quite well. So our Innovate colleagues who run the Regulatory Sandbox and Advice Unit, amongst others. But more specifically, my role spans the kind of Regtech focus, so really thinking about kind of fostering and support the Regtech ecosystem, understanding and identifying trends and opportunities, bringing that insight into the organisation. You'll know our tech sprint programme probably very well, and then our more recent arrival in the kind of suite of services is the digital sandbox. And that tool, and we'll probably talk about it a little bit more later, is really the sort of genesis for that really came from what we were seeing in the tech sprint program about the need for access to data for testing and experimentation and for scaling, but also really important points around creating a network around collaboration and engagement to support early proof of concept to proof of value kind of scaling. And then the other side of my shop is the subtech, essentially subtech. So how can we use AI and machine learning to develop tools to put in the hands of our colleagues across the regulator, whether that's in supervision, enforcement, or kind of the more back office kind of functions, if I can put it that way. And so I run a team of data scientists, I run a team with product engineers. And then we have a function that's also about really helping the organisation to consume and understand the role that sort of advanced analytics can play in helping them do their jobs differently. So around learning and development, communities of practice. So it's a really diverse brief. It's a really interesting and exciting role. And it's one that I am privileged to do.
Very good. Thank you very much. It sounds like that you're sitting right in the heart of what a lot of people in the marketplace talk about is we have to collect all this data and we give it to the regulators, and there you are, you're sitting there in the middle of consuming it, really.
I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I think, we've talked a lot as a regulator about, needing to be data-led and enabled. And what does that mean when you dig underneath that? I think if you look across the globe, and I think probably COVID has accelerated this, the need for digital transformation amongst the global regulatory community is, I think, a trend that, is very clear. For us at the Financial Conduct Authority, that kind of manifests in a variety of ways. From my vantage point, it's about how do we deploy the skills and capabilities to really use the data that we ingest as an organization, whether that's through reg returns or whether that's unstructured data, open source data, to help us, to automate processes, to predict and identify trends, emerging harm, because as I'm sure the audience understands, we have a very, very broad regulatory waterfront of over 56,000 firms, and that requires us to really think about kind of the what are the range of skills and capabilities that we need to bring forward to kind of really enable us to do that. And I think it's also something about thinking about actually the kind of expectation of digital transformation writ large. So what does that mean for consumers and firms and others? So yes, it's a really key part of our agenda.
Very good. Okay, so let's move on with our Q&A. And you mentioned in passing there the COVID pandemic. So let's talk about that a little bit. So from your vantage point, how do you think the pandemic has changed the regulatory landscape in terms of regulators' attitude toward innovative technological solutions on one side, and regulated entities' appetite for Regtech solutions in general? How's it changed things?
I think this is such an important question, and it was something that we started to contemplate actually quite early on in the COVID pandemic. You know, one of the pieces of work that we commissioned last year, actually in the summer of last year, a bit earlier than that, was to really understand what impact COVID was having, because you know it was clearly a kind of a really crucial pivot point. And so, you know, our early reflections from last year was that it was almost like a game of two halves. You know, clearly COVID in the kind of the drive to virtual, really created the space for Regtechs to play and to kind of really showcase the services that they offer in terms of, you know your customer onboarding, AML financial crime, but also what we were seeing is, and I think, you know, from a vantage point now for sort of 18 months on, I would say it's different, but certainly at that time, you know, challenges around investment and the ability for Regtechs to scale, but I think that was kind of a global picture. Where we are now, I think, is that, you know, Regtechs have really capitalized on the opportunities that have been presented by COVID. And what do I mean by that? I mean, you know, we saw, you know, writ large, not just UK but globally, you know, significant kind of regulatory kind of sort of changes that required Regtechs to help distill that on behalf of the regulatory community. I've already touched upon, you know your customer and kind of virtual onboarding as kind of key strengths that play to the key areas that play to the strength of Regtechs. And on the investment point, I think I would now say that actually what we've seen is really strong growth. And so, I mean, you know, one of the figures that I was looking at in preparation for today's conversation is, you know, global Regtech investment hit $9.2 billion in the first half of this year, already exceeding the total for the previous year. And so I think that kind of really shows the very strong position that Regtech is in, and that investment has been consistently trending upwards for the past 6 years. So any concerns that we might have uncovered, you know, earlier on in the pandemic about, you know what's happening in that investment space, I think has not been borne out as we have progressed through. And but the research that we did was really important for us in trying to unpick some of those trends and get under the surface a little bit more. You know, and I've mentioned that, you know, growing regulatory changes kind of, you know, really play to the strengths, know your customer. But on the other hand, that we saw some real challenges as well. And, you know, we interviewed over 500 sort of key decision makers across regulated firms. And what they were saying to us was that, you know, and I think this is probably not a surprise for this audience, but, you know, integrating with legacy systems still remains a challenge. Raising awareness of Regtech and the role that it can play, you know, how does that awareness filter in and proliferate, across, and then growing talent pipelines to deal with, you know, complex compliance and technology issues. These were seen as some of the persistent sort of and significant blockers for more widespread adoption and integration of Regtech. I mean, in terms of our attitude, I mean, I think, you know, I mentioned in sort of my opening remarks about my role, kind of, you know, the FCA's drive to become data-led and enabled, you know, as part of that kind of transformation, really thinking about what insights we can draw from the Regtech community and diffuse those into the organization so they can understand the technology, understand how it is being used, understand how we might capitalize on it from a subtech point of view. I mean, that's something that we've done as part of my shop for the last few years anyway. But I think, the kind of I think it is really key for us as a regulator, to ensure that we are in close contact with the Regtech ecosystem, to ensure that we are aware of what technological approaches are being used and developed, as I said, to inspire and inform our own internal agenda. And looping, if I can make one final point, looping back to the kind of the piece I said about global regulatory change and transformation. I chair GFIN, the Global Financial Innovation Network's Regtech and Subtech workstream. Now, what I would say to this group is actually that is the most popular workstream in GFIN. It has the largest number of members party to that group. We have 3 distinct work streams, one on reg reporting, one on reg ecosystem, and one on Regtech ecosystem, and one on subtech. And actually, understanding the Regtech ecosystem and what it means allows us also to educate, raise awareness, inspire, identify opportunities on a global scale as well. So not just for us as an FCA, but us as a member of a global community.
Very interesting. How can people get involved in that, Francesca? Is that something you can do through the website?
So you can find out more about GFIN via our website. Members are kind of the regulatory community, but we have showcase days, symposia, so there is more information to find out on if members look for GFIN.
Very good. Thanks very much. Okay, so you've mentioned the sort of Regtech and subtech areas of things that you are responsible for. Could you give us a feel for what the areas of focus are for the Regtech and the subtech sort of initiatives within FCA, and how you see them impacting regulated firms this coming year?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it will be no surprise if I lead out on that, I answer on kind of ESG and green finance and sustainability. We are still in the midst of COP26. I know when I turn on the radio in the morning, that's top of the news headlines, and rightfully so. And audience members might be aware that a few weeks ago, so the week before COP26 launched, we held our ESG data and disclosures tech sprint. And that was a really compelling week of nearly a dozen teams coming together to identify, actually for the first time, subtech solutions that could really support the global regulatory community. So ESG, green finance, sustainability is a core strategic priority for the FCA, and it's really key, as in my world, to think about how we can deploy the insights, the capabilities, the tooling that we have to support that from a Regtech and a subtech point of view. My colleagues in Innovate, for example, are doing a Green FinTech Challenge as well. And the second cohort of our digital sandbox is looking at ESG data and disclosure as well. So and we announced the successful applicants last week at COP26, and that cohort will be running from the early new year. So ESG, green finance, sustainability is a core area where we are seeking to support. For those of you who are really in the weeds and enjoy going through the FCA's business plan, AML and fraud remain a significant strategic focus for the organisation, and we have a strong work plan across Regtech and subtech that is supporting that area. And what I would say is, one of the key areas of focus for me underpinning that is really thinking about what that Regtech to subtech bridge looks like. How do we really inform and engage our regulatory colleagues within the business about the insight that is in the Regtech ecosystem, but similarly how we can bridge that insight into shaping our subtech agenda, and thinking about the kind of capabilities that we need to point at some of the pain points that we might be we might be experiencing. So, on that, our subtech program is, our advanced analytics program is in it's no longer a baby. I would say it's probably kind of out of toddlerdom now. It's 3 or 4 years old, and we are very focused on developing proof of concepts and products that support the FCA's core priorities. Again, that sits around sort of AML and financial crime, thinking about ESG data and disclosure around sustainability, supporting some of our key kind of domain areas as well. So it is an ongoing kind of focus of activity for us.
Very good. That segues quite nicely into my next question, which is about what you've done yourselves within the FCA. Could you describe an example of the successful adoption and deployment of Regtech within your organisation, and give us a feel for what the key ingredients were for that success?
I think it's a really, really good question. I was smiling because I think it's always, wide scale adoption is always is absolutely key, right? When anyone is developing tools, proof of concepts, you want to be able to kind of scale them enterprise wide. What I would do is I would touch on kind of 3 areas of core capability that we have looked to develop that actually, their genesis was really inspired by what we were seeing in the Regtech ecosystem. So we have looked at kind of automated kind of web scraping of social media and sort of other open source information to help us really identify emerging harm at the perimeter. That has been a really core area for us. We developed it, with all the areas we do know, developers proof of concept with clear ideas on use case deployment, and then scale as we test and iterate those models. There's actually a huge amount of requirement for business change support, comm support as well, so that we are really kind of making sure that those tools land very, very successfully and used. So kind of web scraping, and then that has applicability across a variety of regulatory functions. I've talked about kind of identifying harm at the perimeter, and that's been really key. Natural language processing. We saw this, we continue to see the kind of role that natural language processing plays. I mean, we saw it, a lot of the, we're seeing that a lot in the kind of Regtech ecosystem. We ingest as an organization, I mean, you talked about the amount of data we ingest huge amounts of unstructured data, whether that's at our auth gateway, whether that's as part of our policy consultation process, file review. And so our ability to ingest and automate that process to objectively identify key kind of trends and themes across vast data sets has been absolutely key. And as I said, that has multiple use cases across the business, and then kind of network analytics to really identify relationships, patterns, whether that's individuals or entities, and again, it doesn't take much to think about kind of how the use cases that might be in play for that kind of capability. You asked me about key metrics for success or key indicators.
Yeah. I
mean, I don't think this will be a surprise to your audience. I mean, this is probably key things that they hopefully will resonate. I mean, I'd say agility, I would say user-centered design, and I would say sponsorship. And sorry, you wanted to come in.
I was just going to say sponsorship is to me seems to be a constant. Well, it's a requirement and perhaps an obstacle. So, any advice for people who sit on the outside looking to get sponsorship? I mean, how does it work?
I mean, I can only talk about my experience of deployment within this setting, but I think, two key things is around aligning to the business need creating a tool, and I think it goes back to that user-centered design as well, creating for the need as articulated by the business, not the need that you imagine them to have. Really, we spend a lot of time, in my team. I have a really multidisciplinary team. We have business analysts, business change. That purpose of that wrapper around our kind of engineering and data science community is to really be able to interrogate and tease out what is the problem space that our business colleagues are facing, what is the tooling that they, we can then sort of work through what the tooling spec is, but really understanding what their need is. And that is often, the corollary of that is about, what are the strategic things, what is the FCA really caring about, really exercised about internally, what are the ESG data and disclosures, AML and financial crime, pointing our thinking in and our capability in those areas. Is that also that important route to senior sponsorship? I'd also say there's something about people who are kind of the first movers as well, who have an affinity, an understanding, a desire, a curiosity, to really want to explore.
Absolutely, and I think that, this might be a stretch, but I think that there's a question here from the audience about the digital sandbox. Can you tell us more about this digital sandbox and your future plans for this?
Of course, I love a digital sandbox.
Yeah,
I'll always talk about digital sandbox.
One would imagine that it could be a conduit for generating new ideas and so on and so forth. Tell us a little bit about the genesis of it.
The genesis was very much that, with our tech sprint program, you spin up a tech sprint, typically they last a week. In that time, for any of your people who have been involved in them or maybe haven't, an FCA one certainly, we make available data for testing and iteration. You have the teams, you have the panels, you have the judges, you have the domain experts, whether that's from the ICO or others. And so you create within that week an ecosystem in microcosm, which is about collaboration, and we would talk and we call out explicitly that need for collaboration. But what we found was that, the tech sprint stopped. They would no longer have access to the data. That kind of stimulated ecosystem might also fall away. And so what we were hearing was that, teams who had worked so successfully to develop POCs as part of that tech sprint were sometimes struggling to make that leap to proof of value. And actually, was there, if we thought about our market-facing offerings, Reg Sandbox, tech sprints, we felt there was a gap for a digital testing environment that would also bring together collaborators, engaged participants to support. And that's with the genesis of the digital sandbox. So we launched it in partnership with the City of London Corporation last year. I'm losing track. The years are mushing into one, with a focus on 3 use cases: SME lending, AML and financial crime, and consumer vulnerability. And we learned a huge amount from that experience around quality of data, collaboration. And we have just, as I said, announced the successful applicants for the second cohort, which is looking at sustainability, and they will be kicking off in the new year.
Fabulous. I knew this was going to happen, but we are running out of time. And I have to jump to a question. I think this would be the question that our audience would like me to ask you, given we're short now. But you've explained to us how you're becoming a digital regulator. What should people expect in terms of change in focus and approach? How is that going to impact people who actually are regulated entities and deal with the FCA going forward? What do they need to bear in mind?
So I think, I suppose it's like, what will people see, and what have you already seen? So, I know one of the things we wanted to talk about was cloud, and people will have seen, the move away from Gabriel to Reg Data, and the migration of the firms to that system. And that is very much about, getting the foundations right with our infrastructure is a really key step. How do we make the best use of our own resources, in terms of connecting the dots of intelligence across the organization, drawing on, I've touched on this, strategies and approaches from data science to help us do what we need to do more effectively, more efficiently, getting across the kind of very expansive waterfront that we have to identify harm, to predict emerging harm, but also kind of from a more innovative persuasion, identify opportunities and think about what that might mean. How do we leverage data to create new tools and techniques? And the sheer size of our data provides a very, very rich resource for us. But we've collected millions of pieces of data, and it's about how we really use that effectively with the kind of the tools that we've got. If the eagle-eyed among you might have spotted my boss last week doing a keynote speech on our talking about our data strategy, and she Jessica Rusu, I'd encourage you to check it out if you haven't seen it, talked about our desire to build a digital unified intelligence environment, to really start thinking about the paths to harm. How do we kind of bring in kind of that kind of focus for us using sort of digital tools and techniques? What does that mean in terms of how we collect and store and analyze our data, and across the intelligence life cycle? So I think there is, I think people will see a continued drumbeat and discussion, explanation about how we are evolving and maturing our data strategy, what that means in terms of tech and innovation within the organization, what we can learn, what we can use, what we need to understand, because as we know, the pace of change is exceptional. And our need to keep pace with that remains profound.
Very good. Okay, well, sadly we are out of time. I think we could have gone on quite a bit longer, actually. So next time we'll have to mark that for a bit longer.
Note to self.
Yeah, we note to self a bit longer. We did skip over the cloud issue. I think the interesting thing about cloud is that over again, partly perhaps due to the pandemic, it's gone from, say, 2 years ago being to sort of like a thing that we all need to worry about to pretty much mainstream in a record time. I mean, yesterday's conversation was with cloud in the background as a given, if you like. I mean, I think everybody now thinks that we are doing everything pretty much toward the cloud. Whether we're there or not is a different matter. But anyway, we could talk at length about that, but we really appreciate you sharing your views on this stuff. Your enthusiasm for this shines through, and that's really great to see. You can tell you've spent your last couple of years totally immersed in the Regtech world, and long may it continue. So many thanks for that, Francesca, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon. Let me move on, and next up will be I'll be handing over to my friend Mark Davies of Element 22, who'll be interviewing Anthony Tarr, Project Director for Digital Innovation and Watch Leader at Societe Generale, in another fireside chat looking at how privacy-enhancing technologies, that's now a thing with its own three-letter acronym, PET. So they'll be talking about how PET can help unlock value and improve compliance. Let me welcome Mark and Anthony. Mark will be handling this fireside chat. Mark is partner and head of London office for Element 22, which helps clients to modernize and develop their capabilities in data management and analytics. Areas of specific focus for Mark include the ESG data landscape, data strategy, capability assessments, and unstructured data. Mark also has an active interest in development and adoption of PET technology through the DANI consortium, which Element 22 helps to coordinate. Mark, welcome, and let me hand the reins over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Andrew. And hi, Anthony.
Hi, Mark.
Hi. Okay, let's just kick off with a very quick introduction, and then I'll hand over and introduce Anthony in his role as our expert today. Today, financial institutions are faced with many complex challenges, as we know. Many of these are solved in isolation. So whether that's AML, KYC, transaction monitoring, data management, fraud detection, looking at creditworthiness of customers. All of these typically are independent tasks that firms have to carry out. And this comes at great expense and, of course, with varying degrees of success and failure. And the privacy-enhancing technologies I think, are a fascinating topic and a fascinating set of technologies. They promise a great deal, and even probably give us a glimpse into the future of secure collaboration between firms. You know, a future where client lists and anonymity can be protected, but problems can be solved together. And this would come at a fraction of the cost and with increased control and, of course, new insights that only collaboration can bring. So with that as a backdrop, I'd like to introduce Anthony, our expert speaker for today's fireside chat. Anthony is a project director with Societe Generale. And Anthony, maybe if we could start by asking you to introduce your role.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm a project director on the innovation department at the Societe Generale corporate investment banking side, especially focused on all projects in regards of blockchain, DLT, and privacy enhancing technology, and recently on NFT and metaverse. And also, I'm mandated for Societe Generale to lead the initiative that Mark is our moderator in regards of the DANI initiative, where we use the technology of privacy enhancing technology in order to benchmark the data quality of our clients with our peers.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Conscious that my video is jumping up and down a little bit at the moment, so hopefully that will resolve itself, but apologies for that. Let's start with the fundamentals. What are privacy enhancing technologies, Anthony? And why have they become interesting recently?
Sure. So maybe for privacy enhancing technology, if we want to define in a nutshell, it's kind of umbrella term describing technologies that secure data in use and are essential to preserving and enhancing privacy and security while searches and analytics are performed. So it allows institutions to unlock the value in sharing financial data without compromising the privacy and confidentiality from the data owners, so all the data coming from the clients, and the data stewards, the financial institution, and of course with respect of the to all the data privacy legislation and compliant with bank regulation. So we usually, compares cybersecurity and privacy enhancing technology. So cybersecurity is where the aim is to focus on protecting data that are not that other people cannot access. Whereas when we are talking about privacy enhancing technology, these technologies are focusing on enabling the derivation of useful results from data without giving other people access to this data. So in general, when we are looking on privacy enhancing technology, we have to think of a kind of 5 pillars of privacy enhancing technology, such as a trusted execution environment, secure multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption, differential privacy, and zero knowledge proof. So depending on your use case, there is a kind of combination possible about all these pillars. But usually what we mention, it's, for homomorphic encryption, secure multi-party computation, and ZKP, it's more technologies that will allow collaboration with our peers compared to differential privacy and trusted execution environment, where it's more a way to secure data when we were thinking of, for example, transferring data to a public cloud, for example.
Okay, fantastic. So different types of privacy enhancing technology. You talked about 5 different types there, and pros and cons of each in different situations, it would seem. Anthony, sorry, go on.
So it really depends on the use cases that we want to work on, about the sensitivity of the data. And I think it's compared to the use cases is where we think of, maybe, for example, if we're talking about sharing sensitive data, we've been thinking of homomorphic encryption, or whether, the data, it's not that sensitive, and maybe, for example, differential privacy, where we added some noise, might be also a good solution to do some data sharing.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. And why would you say that they've become interesting recently as a set of technologies? What's changed? What's made it more interesting?
So on my side, I start to explore these technologies thanks to the tech sprint of the FCA that has been in summer 2018, where the FCA managed to onboard scientific community, also fintech, regtech, banks, in order to do some proof of concept on use cases within the AML framework and financial crime, and where I start to learn about privacy enhancing technology, especially on the report by the Professor Frank Forniol from the Royal Society of UK in Cambridge. And it's where we see that there is an ecosystem in 2018 already existed, led by the FCA. And we see that since 2021, more regulators, more law enforcement also are part of this ecosystem, like Europol and Interpol, who start to organize some workshop and webinar who shows the benefits of this technology, especially when we're talking about issue on fraud payment or how to tackle financial crime. And also, since this summer, the FATF also did release a report recommending banks to collaborate and share their data in order to, fight against this illicit fraud payment, and using and trying to use this kind of technology in order to collaborate, but anonymously and with data encrypted.
Okay, great. So for those that are interested in the topic, we can see momentum's building. A number of bodies are picking up and writing white papers and talking about these concepts of privacy technology. It sounds as though there's some good background reading available that people can find. Super.
And also, from Gartner last year did mention the 9 trends in terms of technology that will be evolved. And this year also, they did release another report giving the trends for 2022. And they say that privacy enhancing technology is part of these trends. And they go further, saying that by 2025, 60% of big companies will use this kind of technology, whether in order to protect the sensitive data they have, especially when we're talking about transferring data in the public cloud, but also this kind of technology in order to collaborate with peers, in order to get some insight that if we're working in silo, definitely we won't be able to get.
Great, thank you, Anthony. So then just thinking about the problems that privacy enhancing technology can solve, and the use cases associated with pets. Maybe if you can talk to some of the use cases that you see, that your organization sees, or that you've seen in the broader industry around privacy enhancing technology. But also, what are the problems that it's solving?
So in regarding of use cases in the financial sector, I think there is quite a lot of use cases, can say. So whether it's about using this technology in order to measure the quality of our KYC data, and DANI initiative is one of the initiatives that shows how powerful this technology are, and how this technology will enable financial industry banks to benchmark the data between them, without having this issue to revealing the relation between bank and the clients. Also, some use cases around data sharing and data transfer that I mentioned earlier, using, for example, an enclave trusted exchange environment in a public cloud in order to protect all our data in a public cloud. Within the AML framework, there's a lot of use cases, whether we're talking about transaction monitoring, and we've seen already many initiatives around the world, whether it's in Netherlands with the TMNL, whether in the North Europe, where there's also use cases around the KYC AML. Also some initiative in Switzerland, in Great Britain, and in Germany, where we have a lot of banks who are collaborating together with the support of their regulator in order to share their data, the transaction monitoring data, in order to tackle this issue. Other use cases around AML is on the SARS issue, suspicious activity report, where we see that, for example, for a big bank, a group of banks that have different entities around the world, be able to get all the suspicious activity report of their entity. It's also a nightmare because we are facing the data sharing regulation of the country. So let's say if we are based in Switzerland or in Taiwan, where you are not allowed to transfer your suspicious activity report out of your country, how the headquarters of the bank are able to get this document and be able to respond through the regulator. So maybe using this kind of technology, we enable each headquarter to do some query and get some info without having this document out of the country.
Okay.
Also, fraud payment. Yeah, sorry.
No, please go. Sorry.
Yes, a lot. There's also fraud payment, where also this kind of technology will enable us to tackle this issue by asking banks to collaborate and share all the transactions of their clients. So this is really, let's say, a small list of use cases under AML. Another use cases that on my side I'm exploring, it's about trade-based money laundering. So trade-based money laundering as defined by the FATF. This one is a process of disguising the proceeds of crime and moving value through the use of trade transaction in the attempt to legitimize their illegal origin or finance their activities. So trade-based money laundering is a kind of it's a way to take advantage of the complexity of the trade system, and most prominently in the international context, where the involvement of multiple parties and jurisdictions makes the ML checks and customer due diligence process more difficult. And we see that this kind of issue have increased since 2019, and FATF did release recently a report recommending also banks to have a kind of public partnership in order to tackle this issue. And we see that there's a lot of interest, whether we're talking about customs, whether we're talking about transport company and banks, to try to collaborate and see how we can work together in order to reduce this amount of TBML.
Okay, well, there's a long list there of
Yes.
areas where privacy technology can be used to help. I think it sounds as though the vast majority of those examples are in the collaboration space. So helping different financial institutions to come together and securely share information, whether that be around transaction monitoring between different organizations, whether that's related to fraud or some of the other use cases that you've mentioned around KYC. So the collaboration and that sort of secure and anonymous information sharing sounds as though there are many use cases, and we've probably only scratched the surface there. I think the other interesting one that you mentioned there was the cross-border use case internally within financial institutions, where for the large complex global organizations who need to share data and information across borders, the challenges associated with that prevent information from necessarily being passed in certain cases, but privacy technology there as an enabler to share insights, maybe rather than necessarily handing a document, but actually to share some of the information in a secure manner. So I think that's maybe a little bit different to some of the collaboration opportunities, but again, it's another interesting use case and potentially one of many internal use cases for organizations using privacy tech as well. Fantastic. We're going to have an audience poll now. And so I'll just quickly read through the questions, which appeared very quickly. Would your business or customers benefit from the use of privacy enhancing technologies? The scale ranges from very significantly, somewhat, not so much, or not at all. So if I could ask you to vote on that, please, and then we'll move on to the next question, and we'll come back to the results of the poll shortly. So while the audience are voting on that question, Anthony, the next question I have is, privacy enhancing technologies are emerging to help enable data collaboration, but what are the challenges? What are some of the challenges in terms of adoption, and also where can we see inefficiencies? So what are the problems with privacy technologies? It can't all be perfect.
No, you're right. You're right. In regards of the challenge we may face when using this technology, I think the first one, it's about the technology itself. So depending on the maturity of the knowledge of this technology within each banks, for example, when we're talking about, a collaboration with banks, because for this kind of technology, the more banks participating to this initiative using this technology is where we're able to get some value. Because two banks using this technology, there's nonsense, because it's not a way to use this kind of technology. We should think of at least 5 banks who participate, share the data, and anonymously and encrypted in order to get the insight. But the thing is, we're facing 5 banks, maybe with different size, where the maturity of the technology is not the same. And when we are starting, let's say, to start working on a proof of concept, is where we may face some challenge, especially when at the onboarding of this bank, about where do they stand about this technology? Do they have their IT, cybersecurity, and architect involved and know about this technology? Also, using when we are talking about data sharing of sensitive data, when we transfer the data out of our system, it's something that we have to get validation from our compliance, our legal, and all this validation that we may have will depend on how mature is this technology among each banks. So a big group of big banks can have several step of validation in order to do proof of concept, compared to a small one maybe don't have the expertise on the technology and might need more times to review this technology. So I think this is one of the major big challenge that when we are talking about collaboration on privacy enhancing technology that we may face. The second one is maybe, as we mentioned earlier, about the legal and policy and regulatory issue that may affect the usage of pets, and especially when we're talking about data sharing across multiple jurisdictions. It's where we have to make sure prior to do the transfer of the data that we are not facing with the regulation of an entity where we are not allowed to move out the data out of the country. So this one, there is a due diligence to be done prior to the proof of concept, and that part, I think, it's very important to make sure that we respect all the regulation, whether it's the GDPR or the data sharing regulation of the country. So this is the second challenge. And the third one, it's really a minimum of parties in order to benchmark or to do some analysis on some data using this kind of technology.
And I think that's something that we've certainly seen on the DANI consortium side, having really the critical mass of firms at the table becomes very important. It's not really, privacy technologies for the collaboration use cases are dependent on enough firms being able to contribute information, all having gone through their InfoSec sign-off and approvals, and be in a position to share data when everybody else is ready to share information. And so that's certainly one that we've seen firsthand. You talked a little bit about that some of the legal challenges. Do you think that over time we'll see some exceptions put in place for privacy technologies to enable secure information sharing for specific use cases?
I think is a good point that you raise, because this is what the change we are facing in regards of data sharing, especially transaction monitoring. The good thing is we saw some initiative around the world where I mentioned, and we see some flexibility in regards of the jurisdiction in regards of data sharing. And we've seen that if we're talking about data sharing in order to tackle financial crime and anti-money laundering, we see some support of the regulators to be flexible on this kind of, regulation. So I think it's good to involve, our regulators, our supervisor, on this kind of initiative. Technology is helpful because it's a solution that enables the data sharing, but having them to support and give them the ability to give us some flexibility in regards of the regulation of data sharing, maybe it's something also that we see already that happen.
Excellent, and of course that process is not a quick process. It can take a long time to
Sure.
To secure those kind of exemptions or acknowledgements. So this is very much I guess a new set of technologies and a new concept that privacy technology is trying to support collaboration. One other area that relates to some of the challenges that we've seen is around data standards. So standardizing values and standardizing information. I wonder if you can just talk to that, because I know that it's something that we've discussed in the past together.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. We're quite thrilled to be part of the DAN initiative. That maybe you can talk later. It's really the fact that this initiative enable each banks to participate, collaborate, share the data, and in order to be able to get some result, you have to validate and confirm for each data field what is the format that we want to reconcile. And by using this kind of platform where we agree of the format of each data field is where slowly we'll go to a standard of the data field, where in the future, if for example we want to do some analysis or some reporting, we can use this standardization of data field that we will be able to replicate for other use cases.
Fantastic, thank you. I think we had a question or two in Slido, so I was just going to jump to those questions, and then we'll come back to the poll in a second. The first question is, what happens if privacy is breached? Tech isn't perfect! ! Which I think we'd all agree. So what happens if privacy is breached? Is that something that related to privacy technology? Is that something that we have a view on?
I think definitely. It's any technology definitely can have a breach. It's where for each banks prior to go in production live and share the data, we have to make some due diligence. And at Société Générale, for example, prior to participate to the initiative of Danny, typically we have done some due diligence, some review via a third-party expert on this technology, able to do some penetration test on the technology provided by the startup, making sure that there is no hacking possible. And even if these data are hacked, we are not providing the data in clear, and hacker won't be able to decrypt the data in order to get the data in clear. So once we are able to get the validation of this third party who managed to validate the security of the data, plus our cybersecurity, our IT, and our architect, it's where we can say, okay, let's start to do proof of concept. And again, for the Danny one, the first step we've done in order to do the process is performing some data sharing on public data first to make sure that it works, and slowly on sensitive data. But the thing is, every step, each time that we will do some transfer and processing of reconciliation, there is some control that will be made prior to having our data out of our internal system. And I think all the banks will do the same.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Anthony. I know that hashing is also a requirement of many of the organizations' InfoSec policies, and that that's something that we've also had to manage through privacy technology as well, where firms have their own local controls, even over and above what's been done through the privacy tech. So let's quickly look at the poll responses. If we can look at the answers for the poll. Okay, well, that's a very positive response, which says that would your business or customers benefit from the use of privacy enhancing technologies? Significantly at 55%, somewhat at 36%, not at all at 9%. So we'll be reaching out to those individuals after this call for a much deeper conversation on privacy technology. I think that means we need to wrap at the end of our conversation. So apologies again for the flickery video. But Anthony, thank you very much for your time. And handing back to Andrew.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Anthony. Fascinating area of the business. I quite liked that poll there, Mark. It's almost 100% buy signal from the poll. Looks like most people recognizing the value here. So interesting space, something that we clearly need to keep tabs on going forward. So Anthony, thanks again for sharing your expertise in this segment. I'm sure everyone appreciated it. Great job as always, Mark. Time to move on. Let's do that. Next we come to the first panel of the day, leveraging Regtech to create a single holistic view of the customer to manage AML risk and improve KYC. For this session, I'll be handing over moderating duties to Samantha Sheen. Samantha is a financial crime compliance expert, and she's founder and director of Ex-Ante Advisory Limited. She's a former offshore regulator overseeing enforcement cases relating to AML and a standing up inaugural AML supervisory function. She has worked in a variety of head and group level AML roles, and she currently advises financial institutions on operationalizing AML regulations and how to work more effectively in fulfilling those obligations. Sam is also an approved consultant and trainer to the European Council on AML matters. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Sam. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I'm so glad you read out the title rather than me, because it is long. However, it's going to be, but it's going to be interesting. I've got a great group of panelists for this session. So no pressure, folks, who are on the panel, but we're hoping to make this as interesting as possible. Let me quickly introduce it to you. And if folks, you probably appear on my screen slightly different compared to other people watching. So if you can just raise your hand when I mention your name. I have on the panel today Ted Data, who is head of financial crime compliance practice for Europe and Africa from Moody's Analytics Company. I have Igor Sumkovsky, who is senior manager, financial crime advisory, Santander. I have Satish Kumar, director, regional head of data insights and analytics for the Americas for MUFG. And I've got Anne Clendenny, AML transaction monitoring manager of Rabobank. So folks, before we kick off the content of the panel, starting with you, Ted, can you just tell folks a little bit about your role and what your interest is in relation to regulatory change management?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Hey, everybody. Thanks for the invite. Good to see you and speak to you all again. So I lead what we call our industry practice group here for Europe and Africa. We are very much about engaging with regulators and standard setters in the market to understand policy direction and how that's going to implicate our customers on their implementation of data and technology in that 3 to 5 year cycle that everyone is planning for. Moody's Analytics is on a mission to bring a new level of transparency and fairness to financial markets, and within the financial crime space, using our data assets, insights, and models to improve what we all probably appreciate is a sorry state of affairs, quite frankly, when it comes to detecting risk and mitigating financial crime. So that's me, that's the group. I look forward to chatting to you all over the next hour or so. Brilliant,
thank you. Over to you, Igor.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks for organizing this, the A-Team group. I'm Igor Sumkovsky, Senior Manager in Santander, UK, Financial Crime, recently focusing more on the sanctions aspects, policy and advisory. Before that, since 2012 in various anti-financial crime roles. Key interest is probably recently developing how we can bring the Regtechs and the banks together, because I think both of parties can benefit if they come together closer and understand each other better.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Satish, over to you.
Hi, Sam. Hi, everyone. This is Satish Chala. I work at MUFG as Director of Data Insights and Analytics for the Americas region. And I've been in financial services industry for over 17 years. And in my current role, I focus on two major areas. One primarily being the data analytics, and the second one is the model risk management space. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
And finally, last but not least, Anne.
Hi, good morning, good morning. I'm in the United States. My name is Anne Clendenny. I am with Rabobank in the Rabobank North America division. My primary focus is on transaction monitoring. And with Rabobank New York, we focus on commercial lending, trade finance, agricultural lending. So I'm happy to discuss with all of you and happy to be here.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for that. Now, I've got two screens going at the moment, so forgive me, I'm going to look over on my left-hand side, and that's because we're going to open up with a poll question. So I'd invite all of you to click on over to the poll page, and for my participants on the panel, they can't actually see it, so I'm going to read it out real quick. The poll question is, what is your greatest challenge in designing a process which provides a single comprehensive picture of a customer's risk profile? And your choices are increasing volumes of customer data, inaccurate customer data, managed siloed and fragmented data and systems, and finally, customer screening, identification, and verification. So we'll give the audience a chance to vote. And let's start off with my first question. And I'm going to come back to you, Ted, because your organization helps a diverse range of financial institutions. So I'm interested to know, based on the diversity of conversations you have, what are you hearing in terms of where they are on their journey of harnessing data to provide that single view? And not just onboarding, which everyone talks about a great deal, but throughout the whole life cycle.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. That's a great poll, by the way. I'm really intrigued by the answer of that poll. So I think where we see people, and I'll unpack this a bit, is moving a little bit from the why question and now thinking more about the how question. So the why question is one that legal's often asked, and I guess to an extent operations and other parts of the business, is why should we be doing this? What value does it bring to understand our customer? Not just like you say onboarding, which is where clearly you need to get really deep data, for example on KYC files, to thinking about the how to do that, in a sense that I think the use case and value of that has been fairly now proven in the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, fines. I was reading the prosecution notes on the ABN AMRO case, and yeah, the lack of in-life understanding of the customer profile by layering on things like transaction data, but alongside that adverse media, external regulatory data and corporate registry content. So the why, I think, is kind of proven, and the business case has been fairly well made by legal and also by customer operations, because if you know more about your customers in life, you can sell them more products, and guess what, that's quite appealing to organizations of all size and scale. Where I think we are now is we're in the kind of era of how. So if I think about how, a really good report came out, FATF report in July, in fact 2 reports, I'm sure you know them well, one about opportunities for technology and data and KYC and ML, and one about barriers and challenges and focusing on data sharing. And I think the how is now mired in those 2 challenges around data, one being quality of data, and the second being shareability of data, or more importantly, decisions and insights. So I think we're in that era of how, operationalizing that. Data quality may seem simple to do when you're a smaller organization, right? If you've only got one CRM system, or you haven't acquired businesses and you're onboarding similar entity types and similar profile types, that gets very complex as you scale. And that how of the quality, then we think about new techniques to resolve these entities to single profiles, and that can get very complicated very quickly. sharing data. I'm sure we'll get onto that more later, but there's sharing data fundamentally, firstly, within the institution. Let's forget about all the things we could think about in terms of utilities and the models there, but sharing data within the institution, that falls down without workflow tools. And again, getting the right type of workflow tools into the hands of the compliance function so they can share data with their business internally, externally. And then the final piece, externalizing that utilities. Now, we'll talk more maybe later. We're seeing them starting to work in parts of Europe, either on specific focuses like KYC or transactions. So I think like we're in that how operationalizing it phase, which is exciting, right? Because I think the use case, regulatory wise, customer value wise, has been proven, and now we're starting to see people make it happen.
Well, it's interesting, the question of how, because we have a look here at the poll results, which I'm apparently supposed to be able to see. The poll results tell us, dun, 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 the poll results tell us that managed silo and fragmented data systems. I honestly did not set up the audience to do this because this is exactly the next question I had for Satish. So this is brilliant. But the vast majority of people have said something that, Satish, when you and I were chatting, this comes right back to what you were discussing with me, which is, what do you think financial institutions can do to help bring those data sets together to get that single view? I mean, what's it going to take to do that? How, Satish?
Yeah, I'm really surprised with the poll results, but again, it's not a real surprise, I would say, because that's a common problem, and it's a classic, problem across the organizations worldwide. So, if you see this, again, we are not here just overnight, and it's been legacy issues over a period of time, and the way industries and organizations have evolved over time, right? But then we see a major shift, the way industry is, really moving their focal point, and organizations are trying to build data-centric organizations or rallying across data culture, right? That's the only way they can really embrace for moving forward, not only to set up effective AML programs, but also benefit other lines of verticals. Like, I mean, if you really have a great data-centric organization, you can definitely achieve revenue, sales, and operate in a much safer environment to provide your services to your customers in a much safer environment. And everybody knows that, and that actually keeps the organizations to be relevant. Now, how do we get there, or what are the major challenges to beat these silos? If we have to go a little more low level, now that we know that organizations are going that route anyway, obviously it's the democratization of data. How does it start off with? You can start with grand visions like setting up a secure data lake, but again, it's not like the way Ted just mentioned. It's easier said than done to establish this secure data lake, which really meets the overall objectives of the organization, not only from a regulatory landscape, but also from various business verticals as well. So that would be a starting point. And to that, you will have to obviously go it a little more granular to really embed this discipline across the organization, to go to the data level attributes, document the data lineage, establish the data lineage, document data dictionaries. Then once everybody in the organization really knows what's there, what is the scope of data which they have, and makes sense, and how they can really channel those and establish and connect those sources back to the data lake, I think that would be a way to really beat the silos. In addition to this, obviously, when we put in this grand visions, we shouldn't forget the importance of the governance piece of it. To beat the silos, we also need to have sustainable data governance procedures, which can push the quality of data, or even the completeness of data on an incremental basis. So it's not a one-time thing. It's an evolving phase which has to iteratively happen within the organization.
It is really interesting, isn't it? I just spoke to a client the other day, and we were talking about screening automated onboarding of customers against internal lists of clients who've tried to come in or we've had to throw off because we've had concerns about them. And it hadn't occurred to anybody that the drop-down list for rejected customers has wording that is completely misaligned to all the other systems we have. So we can't actually search it and match it up with any other data because they've used different terminology. Is that sort of the examples you're thinking of, Satish?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, this is one of the things where we try to solve. I mean, we rush into solving the problem based on our historical information, but we need to really take a pause, understand what's really going on, what's the limitations we currently have, and assess proper success criteria based on the underlying data set. So rather than really go on mapping the usual traditional way where we know that these are our red flags, okay, let's set up a rule and then it solves the problem. No, it shouldn't. I mean, in general, it doesn't. And you get to know that later in the game when you really go into rallying your resources against what really went wrong with the systems or models which you have built and why it is not really functioning the way you are functioning. So yeah, one of them could be definitely solved by connecting the dots, understanding the behaviors, and really coming up with a hybrid typologies, which I generally am really passionate about, because the detection mechanisms or whatever we have traditionally placed have run their course, and in the digital age and with modern technology innovations, the behavior of clients, the suspicious activity patterns have completely transformed. So we have to really catch up and start thinking out of the box.
So it's interesting, Ted, because do you remember in the old days, you couldn't put in a solution without someone saying the dreaded, you're going to have to clean up all your data first. It was going to have to be a totally separate exercise. And pretty much you lost everybody at that point when you try to talk about creating these solutions. I mean, does that kind of resonate with you?
I think to a certain extent, right? I've always got my structured data hat on with we need corporate structures. We need to understand beneficial ownership. What levels are we talking about? There's got to be some determination of policy on the some fundamentals, but I hear what you're saying, and you see tools where now the tool itself is smart to learn the data model in the bank. What is it that the institution defines as certain things, and that is a nice step forward, right? You haven't got to predetermine every model, every attribute. The platforms can learn about the attributes and advise on efficiencies using that attribute or the model that you have as an organization. So there's always a trade-off. I think there should be some flow back to vendors, to the market, to look for advice on what good looks like as well, because we are solving these things in multiple areas for different customers, different segments. So yeah, I agree, things have moved forward, but at the same time, there are just some fundamental building blocks that need to be there. But yeah, it is an interesting time with the tools available in the marketplace.
Sure. Well, look, I don't want to be, as I heard this expression yesterday, a mood hoover by just talking about negative things and challenges. So I'm going to flip this a little bit and talk about solutions. So how do we use the technology solutions available to us or that we're in the process of building? So I want to hear some success stories about how you yourselves have either in your organization or amongst your professional colleagues in your sectors where you've seen it work really well in terms of managing that life cycle process. And let me turn to you.
Yeah, as you know, with Rabobank, obviously we do business all over the world, as do many of you. So we've had some challenges with our client onboarding systems. In North America might be one system, in London might be another, in the Netherlands it's yet another. So the bank has decided that to help get everyone aligned is to go to one system. So we're slowly transitioning all of the client files, the KYC, where it's housed to one system, and that is it's helping and what they can do and what they're starting to do, and it's a project, so obviously we're not fully there yet, but it's taking the global name screenings, whether it's in the United States, if it's for 314A, which is put out by by FinCEN or if it's other negative news screenings, and it's running them through this global program or global process in order to filter the information to the relevant areas within the bank that would need it, like CDD, like TM. So it's updating these client files with, the relevant and material information that's being automated. So that is helping. We're obviously not there yet. It's still a project, and we're working, but it is showing really good progress. And something else that we're doing.
Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
Well, something else that we're doing, which is very similar, is taking our actual client activities and putting them into the same system. So we're taking our commercial lending, and then we're also taking the trade finance. And then if the client's doing something else with securities or money markets or, whatever the case, investments, it's bringing them all into the same system so that we're normalizing the data, which can then be fed into, our transaction monitoring, can be fed into, any KYC programs. So it's basically we're normalizing the data.
It's a bit like rather than just letting the sheep run amok on the sheep station, you're trying to bring it all into a common pen, so to speak, right?
Yes.
Cool.
Yes, correct.
Very neat. Well, it would be remiss if I'm talking about success and solutions if I didn't talk about transaction monitoring. And Igor, I know this is your wheelhouse, as they say, right? And we know from the ABN AMRO decision, for example, that there was a disconnect between the KYC risk ratings given to certain customers and then the way they were behaving in their transactional behavior. And what was missed a trick, if you like, in that case was a misalignment with the signals from transaction monitoring against those risk profiles to say, is that normal? Has something changed significantly here? And if TM just sits on its own, it's not a particularly good indicator to know if risk is changed in a given customer. So, where have you seen some really good solutions happen there to kind of resolve that misalignment?
Thanks, Sam. Very good question, and I think you're right. I think there are two aspects behind the ABN AMRO fine and generally the challenge that the traditional bank will have. I think KYC and KYB is very important to build a picture initially for your customer, and then what is very important is to keep updating the KYC and KYB. So that's one aspect that will help us to define our transaction monitoring rules and scenarios, and I'll come back to that one after. But the other aspect, very important, is how these two communicate between themselves. So what is the feed from the KYC and KYB into the transaction monitoring systems to help the analyst and the system to understand what is unusual and what is not. But then there is the feedback as well, based on the finding from the transaction monitoring, the outcome. Do we feed this in the customer risk assessment subsequently? So these two aspects. So good. Ted mentioned why and how. So I will use that. I think we know why in the banking sector, because we need to identify the unusual transaction and report to the regulator, and then decide as a bank what to do with that customer, exiting or if we retain, build a strong case, enhance controls, and so on. But how is the question? I think there is a big difference between the traditional banks and the fintechs, probably. If I take the fintechs as a separate category, probably they are in an advantage compared to the traditional banks because they're fairly new on the market, so they can choose their solution probably based on the new parameters and choose something which is fit for purpose. The key problem in my mind that traditional banks are facing is how to enhance your systems without investing too much, because it is not always an easy decision to convince your senior management to change the existing systems with something new. So it is about identifying a solution, AI or machine learning, which will be compatible with the existing legacy systems in the traditional banks, something at the top, and then understanding that solution, how that solution will help. I think as much as we want as financial crime professionals to invest, the other aspect is we need to convince our senior management why we think that that particular solution is good enough. So I think the key there is better collaboration between the Regtechs offering the solution and the financial crime professionals within the bank, helping financial crime professionals to understand the actual solution and then explaining to the senior management. So quantification is very important. For example, if you can define how much you will reduce the noise in the transaction monitoring, if you can say certain percentage will go down if we invest in that particular solution, that will play as an advantage for the financial crime professional. And the last thing, and I'll finish that, even if everything goes well, you convince your senior management, they will invest. Then the last element in that circle is the regulator. So you need to be able to demonstrate to the regulator why you're satisfied that that solution that you have chosen for transaction monitoring, for example, is fit for purpose. And this is where we go back to the root cause. Do we understand our systems and controls? So,
yeah, that is so true. And especially the point you made about going back up to senior management, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it will often be the story that we hear, right? Which is, why would we want to rip out a whole system, put a lot of money in? What's the return I get by investing in this product? Because it's not only about financial crime prevention, but being able to explain why commercially preventing financial crime is such a beneficial thing for the business. And that single life cycle actually has lots of advantages beyond AML. But Satish, a lot of people will get turned off of the notice of the same old song, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Why? Because they're all scared of legacy systems, right?
No, definitely, yes, yeah, and quite rightfully, how Igor put, I completely agree on the challenges to really rally your vision and roadmaps to the senior management and get that buy-in before we could really realize any benefits out of the whole systems. So, I mean, in continuation, right? I mean, again, to my earlier answer, which I was rallying about siloed data, here we have siloed systems in a way, because the legacy systems are not really talking to each other in general, or they had their own issues when they were really developed. They were addressing or catering to a different scope and I would say a risk taxonomy at a point in time. And again, traditional banks, they have gone through a series of mergers, acquisitions, and these all things just add the complexity, and it could be even inorganic growth, the way organizations have grown. So now that becomes a major challenge when things are really in place and okay, you already were able to tick the check boxes from a regulatory standpoint. How do you really bring in that vision of getting a new model which is more advanced or use some newer tech stack? So this is again a classic problem everywhere, because return on investment is the biggest criteria for us, and here we can't really go that path of exploration because it's not really improving your bottom line for the organization. You're really an organization which are trying to control or have that safe environment for the organization. Having said that, I did see several use cases in my past where we were able to convince successfully in terms of quite obvious situations, like when you have infrastructure, really completely aging infrastructure, which is at a cusp where you have to really invest to upgrade it. So do you want to continue that upgrade, or do you want to really transition to much advanced infrastructure which can sustain you for foreseeable future?
So tell me, Satish, let me just jump in, because we have a question. I apologize. I should have said this to you.
Sure.
What do you do, though, about data lineage? I mean, when you're talking about transaction monitoring with some existing customers, you want to create a single life cycle solution, right? And there's so many opportunities to do so. But isn't there a point at which you just have to ring fence some of the old data and go, we just can't make it work. We're not going to be able to read this or interpret it, or we'll just treat it as stale and no longer relevant?
Of course, yeah. I mean, there are some times where you hit a roadblock and the solution for that is not really sitting on that particular data, but then you'll have to create newer mechanisms to capture data which is more, enriched, or which will really meet the newer goals. Then for that, you need to really build a data pipeline with the way you just mentioned about the data lineage, you just need to really say that, okay, let's all pause. We are investing this as a strategic stuff. It is not going to be realized within a year or two, but then within 3 years, we have a journey which will be benefited not just for our line of business, but for all the entire organization. And yes, it can happen in phases. It can go either in sprints, whatever may be the style of the organization, but it has to be done in with a proper vision and supplemental productivity underneath supporting it.
For sure. And that I think that resonated with me a bit, and with the ABN AMRO case that Ted mentioned at the start. And I'm oversimplifying things, and obviously we only have the public documents to go on. And I will say ABN AMRO has done some phenomenal work with their AML program. It makes many people very jealous now. But at the time that decision came out, one of the things they talked about was how the KYC system was not talking to the transaction monitoring system, and that the transaction monitoring rules, as they were set up, and didn't actually set up to the parameters of the risk rated customers. So essentially a customer rated low risk would never have a KYC review. They would only do trigger-based monitoring. But then the transaction monitoring rules were set up such that they never generated any rules or any alerts for low-risk people. So in effect, those customers just never got checked. Similarly, though, exactly what Satish has talked about, there are people needing to make decisions going, we're not going to use that data. We'll put it aside. We'll do something else to it. But surely, for both the decision about what rules to apply for a transaction monitoring tool that will feed back, and for deciding what you're going to look at or not look at, surely there needs to be some kind of risk management or governance exercise around that. I mean, it can't just be left to one team. How do you set the parameters for that end?
Well, again,
sorry, let me just throw that back to Anne. Sorry.
Satish is very excited. So I think with it's difficult, right? It's not an easy or one size fits all solution. You have your low risk customers. Does it make sense to review them with every scenario? Maybe not, but there might be other scenarios that you do definitely want to include. So it's something else that Rabo is working on is kind of grouping customers with similar profiles and using deviations in general customer activity, kind of based on peer grouping, and then incorporating that into the KYC file and using that information in tuning or even creating new TM scenarios. So it's something that we are exploring. Again, it's like everything else, it's a work in progress. But it's something that we're thinking, I hate the term, but we're thinking outside of the box, and seeing what works.
So let me just jump now over to the hot description of the moment in terms of tools for single life cycle review, which is perpetual KYC, PKYC, continuous KYC. Ted, you and I had some communications about not only ABN AMRO, but another really interesting case where, again, they failed to detect changes in customer profile over time, but it wasn't just about the transactions where the changes happened. And the regulators have made it clear, we need to have controls in place across the life cycle to detect these changes. So do you think, Ted, that Regtech's ready to tackle them?
Yeah, I would have to think that, but I would also think that there's a culture thing here, right? So there's a natural handoff and then a diminished responsibility and focus when you onboard a customer at that point of high scrutiny. Then they're in the bank, they're trading different products, they're doing different things. So I should be banging the drum for technology, and I always will do. But at the same time, there's certainly a point around what training are we giving AML investigations analysts, because there are different data sets in the external data world that they're not used to handling. So adverse media is a big old thing. If you throw it without any structure into a whole bunch of alerts, you're not going to get anything useful. You're going to muddy the water, and you're going to not have any kind of effectiveness or efficiency benefit. So there's an education around what to be added into that file to enrich that profile or enrich that alert. then that can feed through. Certainly, yeah, with technology, we can see we can resolve things quicker. We can bring more context. We can see that around the alert. But at the same time, if there's not a program of training and education, and then a culture of surveillance that these things are going to change. Ownership changes so frequently. We talk about it in the case of this webinar. It will change 30 times in our database. So there's frequency of that changing of the data sets out there. So yes, technology is ready, but at the same time, I think compliance professionals and analysts also need to be helped on that journey and trained and educated on what they need to look at and what these typologies alert them to do, and then what to do with those actions and alerts they get in the system. So yeah, two sides to it, I think, Sam.
But and totally different perspective on this, which is, don't you think sometimes the problem is we don't know what it is that we need? In other words, we think, okay, right, I need to be able to make sure I know when changes happen in the risk profile of a customer. But the struggle is then going, well, do we need to check it all? What's the bit that really matters that we need to check? And what's the tech actually going to do to help us get there? You know, do you think sometimes that's the problem, that sometimes we don't know what's good for us?
Yes, it is definitely a challenge. And sometimes there is simply too much information. So it's filtering through, what you are given is, this group of information over here, is it just noise? Is it relevant? Is it material? Does it apply to this segment of customers? Does it apply to the product? And again, as Ted mentioned, it comes down to training and, helping your analysts really analyze the information and make that determination. So, obviously the technology can assist, but at the end of the day, it's still, you still need a human to review whatever it is, whether it's a TM alert, whether it's the KYC file, whether it's something else. You still need that knowledge base and that person to review the information to sift out anything that's not relevant.
Yeah.
Or to find something else that might be relevant outside of technology.
So true. It's so true. Now, I'm conscious we are getting very close to time. And Igor, I haven't really spent a lot of time chatting with you, so I know you're enthused about this topic. Where do you see the most exciting RegTech being used in detecting financial crime along the life cycle?
Yes, I will keep this brief, conscious of the time. We mentioned the transaction monitoring. I think, yeah, we've talked a lot about rules and scenarios, but what we can do with the Regtech is use a solution that will help us based on the past sequences of events to predict the future behavior. That will help, and I agree with Anne, even then we'll reduce the number of the volumes, but then you still need the human being checking somewhere down the line. Another area is payment screening or transaction screening now. I think there is a lot of pressure in that area in particular, because you need to make the right decision, but you only have a limited amount of time to do that because the payment is on the filter, so you need to act fast. Name screening, very similar. Not that urgent probably, but still focus from the regulator. Onboarding, KYC, so probably I mentioned everything. So it is the whole life cycle of the customer where you can use the Regtech. But if I need to go for one, the key is the KYC and KYB. That is the key because it starts from there. And in my mind, payment screening, very important because of the time pressure and because of the risk of being fined if something goes wrong.
Oh, cool. Satish, the last word goes to you. Where is the exciting developments you are seeing, not just theoretically, but practically being applied to prevent financial crime?
Again, in terms of the excitement, I see the buzzwords like the big data, machine learning, and again, these all things are backed up by traditional statistical models, right? And building the models is really the world where we are trying to even encounter legacy systems, have parallel sandbox environments where we can experiment, explore, and I see great avenues of solutions possible because of this. And when you tie up the big data part, specifically with the big data, you can really use network analysis, graph tree traversal. understand customers, and there's possibilities are really opened up, which were earlier theoretical. Right now it's more practical, and with the access to compute power in financial crime space, the analysis, the turnaround cycles in terms of implementing solutions which are parallel, and where you can experiment, fail, and still learn from that failure and iteratively improve, is the really big possibilities for us. And I see that again in the past several use cases, like Igor just mentioned about all the risk taxonomies. To name a few, natural language processing is being effectively used in sanctions screening to reduce the false positives, thereby reducing the human element, the capacity which we are generally constantly worried about. Or even build a parallel transaction monitoring predictive model which can really merge two typologies and actually bring in two risks which were not seen or visualized earlier. So actually this kind of effective avenues are not really explored in the past or over a decade ago, but now it has become a reality and it becomes the norm. So I'm quite excited, and leading to this pandemic is propelling further the way we operate as a digital economy. So again, in terms of payments, transactional behavior, every consumer is forced to be to be online. So this really propels more data-centric solutions going forward.
Well, I tell you what, we've gone from me saying we were a mood hoover at the start to being just absolute balloon of optimism. And for that, I thank all of my panelists, Ted and Igor, Satish. It has been an absolute pleasure. Always love chatting with you. I am now going to hand back the session to Andrew to introduce next session. So thank you ever so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. That was a fabulous session. To coin your phrase, Sam, I think the panelists hoovered up your mood of enthusiasm and excitement about financial crime for this one. I felt we could have gone on for quite some time. Interesting that the guys brought up the topic of various screening initiatives, sanctions, payments, transactions. We think that's going to be big coming forward. So really a lot to talk about in future sessions. Great job. Thank you all very much indeed. Really appreciate it. I'm sure the audience appreciated it too. Okay, so let's move on from financial crime. Our next session is going to be talking about regulatory reporting. I think before we get to that session, we're going to hear from our platinum sponsor, IHS Markit, after which my colleague Sarah Underwood will take over as MC for the remainder of the day's session. So let's hear from IHS Markit now.
Well, hello, and thank you for that. Amazing how much you can squeeze into a very short video. So thanks for that. As Andrew mentioned, my name is Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at 18. The rest of today's sessions with our speakers. First, I am very delighted to host a fireside chat with Pierre Kamdoudi, Senior Vice President, Equities and Regulatory Reporting at IHS Markit. We'll be exploring the regulatory reporting journey from a targeted to a holistic approach. Just a quick reminder now I'm on. If you want to ask questions to Pierre, please use the panel to the right of your video screen, and I'll pick those up and put as many as I can to Pierre as we Pierre, and before we get going on our conversation, please introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your role at IHS Markit.
Sure. Hi, Sarah. So my name is Pierre Kamdoudi. I'm a partner at IHS Markit. I run the equities and regulatory reporting division, where we help more than 400 financial institutions in the world to fulfill their global regulatory reporting obligations in a compliant and cost-effective way. This business is supported by more than 200 colleagues globally, and therefore leverage on a deep regulatory expertise developed over the last 2 decades.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's carry on with the conversation, or get going at least. So setting the scene, regulatory reporting journey, and what are the challenges they're contending with?
So first, I wanted to should have started with that. Thanks Sarah and the 18 group, for inviting me to this fireside chat. So to answer your question is there are multiple parameters, but first is as you said, setting the scene. So it's pretty clear that market participants have worked through quite an intense regulatory reporting agenda set by the regulators following the 2008 financial collapse. As a consequence of this rapid succession of significant regulatory reporting events, financial institutions implemented a succession of tactical solutions to ensure their compliance in an incremental way, regime after regime, essentially. Unfortunately, as we are seeing now, it's not going to stop, because we're kind of starting the second wave. Now we have implemented, global regimes. We are implementing the refit, the version 2 of them. And we see that the regulatory reporting regime requirements are becoming more complex, and in some ways, the statistical approach is being challenged. The solution, this approach is. Or this solution born out of this approach, kind of lack scale and struggle with to support the ever-increasing requirements, for the collection and the submission of the data elements supporting this the regulatory reporting activities. Additionally, we found in many cases this solution struggle with the ability to provide a clear data lineage that will allow the reporting institution to clearly understand and monitor their reporting completeness, accuracy, and timeliness. This is a term that I will use, quite a few times, throughout this conversation. Just to give a little bit more context, we run annually, a global regulatory reporting survey, and we collect this year. The latest one, we have collected, answers from more than 100 financial services organizations. And really what this survey told us, as a headline, is that 2/3 of the respondents, to our survey made changes to their regulatory reporting stack over the last year because of inefficiencies and errors. So it kind of demonstrates that the challenges facing by these firms are as they implement their reporting requirements remains high. And just to conclude a little bit in this, looking at the landscape is in a way, we could summarize as most of the financial institutions that we work with, at least the one that we talk to, face, the following challenges. So their stack is costly, to maintain. Their regulatory reporting stack is costly to maintain. It's in many ways, challenging. The scalability is challenged, but more importantly, the visibility is not there in terms of quality of the reporting and completeness of the reporting. So, in a way, if you allow me the expression, when you ask where they are in their journey, it's kind of like regulatory reporting 2.0, where the focus has shifted from core reporting to more of looking after the quality and the completeness of the regulatory reporting.
Okay, thank you. That takes us really nicely into our second question. With all those challenges and so on going on, what are the considerations for moving on from a tactical to a more strategic approach?
So there are internal factors and we'll call them external factors. So first, the internal is we've seen with SFTR kind of a first version, I mean the latest one, SFTR, and we're seeing as well with the refit is there is definitely an increased complexity in regulatory reporting. So there's more data, more complex, data, not only in the collection but as well in the submission, the format that you need to submit, the information to either the trade repository or other regulators or directly to the regulators. That's one thing. So the second thing, so that's one thing to consider. So that pushed people to revisit a little bit their approach. The second part is a bit of an external factor. There's clearly a focus from the regulators as well on the quality of reporting. It's not anymore, just checking whether firms report, is as well how well they report. And we've seen that through either, fines that were issued, to financial institutions, or as well, by the report that were, for example, I think it was in April or something like that, that was, released by ESMA, where they made clear, their intents of monitoring the quality of information through, AMIA and SFTR reporting. So there is kind of an external pressure, to ensure that the financial institutions, have a quality report, have monitor, there, or increase the quality of the reporting. And then finally, as well, the main themes is cost consideration. I mean, I mentioned that before, is this kind of incremental approach that was needed, to go through the onslaught of reports, that the regulatory reporting that was rolled out. It's quite, these stacks are quite costly, and they need to, there is a willingness to figure out how they can be more efficient, but as well more cost efficient in terms of maintaining or managing their regulatory reporting. Just to give you as well a little bit of a context, is the same survey that I mentioned before. Showed that the respondent top two priorities for their roadmap, for their upcoming roadmap, were the improvement of data quality and the enhancement of their reporting regime, processes, and efficiency. So it's not just what we're saying, but it's clearly expressed by, I would say, more of an industry point of view. Make sense?
Yeah, sure. That's great. Thank you very much indeed. And obviously there's a pressing need to do this, but what are the challenges of achieving this and sort of making the step from a more tactical to a strategic approach?
So so we can, I mean, there are few, but at the same time, there is a lot of benefits as well. So the challenges is, first is, there is, I'll start with a bit of a philosophical kind of point of view, is the organization needs to be convinced that they need to progress to the second version, essentially of their reporting. It needs to, because it requires, in many cases, a quite drastic change of tactics, essentially, or of approach. I mean, I may have a bit of a biased point of view because I'm a vendor and providing a solution in that space, but we're seeing many institutions that kind of take their proprietary on-premise, regulatory reporting stack, and they put it to an external, third-party, a vendor like us or our competitors, onto a more of a, modern, technology cloud-based, that allows scalability and cost-efficient, reporting. So, but there needs to be a buy-in, from a management point of view. We're seeing that, that trend is accelerating, definitely. We're seeing that, regardless of the institution, buy side, sell side, smaller or larger, there is a very persistent trend there. The second part is really trying to figure out as well that it's not just, as I said, not just core reporting. Is what do you want to get from the reporting? Is the ability to monitor, the ability to understand exactly what's happening, and as well, try to do more. And maybe I'll comment a bit further, but try to do more with it. It's make the reporting work for you, essentially. So and generally, what we are seeing as well in terms of challenges it's very costly, not only from a technology point of view, but as well from a knowledge point of view, knowledge base. It's very costly for organizations to maintain all that regulatory reporting knowledge, when you across 10, 15 different, regulatory reporting regimes that a decent sized, bank or financial institution might face. It's hard to maintain all that knowledge as it constantly evolves, but as well, it's kind of spread across the world. So that's kind of the challenges. And then maybe the last one, and again, coming from our angle, is there is a safety number as well. So implementing your own solution, you kind of have your own interpretation. When you use a vendor solution, in a way you get, a consensus-based type of, logic that is powering, the whole reporting, regime logic. So in a way you have a bit of a safety numbers because whether, you made a wrong, you can, it's not just one person who made the interpretation, it's a consensus. Everybody's using the same type of logic. And the second part is as well, if you miss, some changes in regulation, then with having, a mutualized solution, you're not going to miss it because, you're going to have many people that are your peers in your sector that will provide, that will be there to actually, make sure that the solution, gets updated. Plus, like us, we have a large team, that maintain that knowledge, across the board.
Okay, as well as mutualized solutions, what other sort of technologies and solutions can be useful here, Pierre? Perhaps cloud, I don't know, other services?
Yeah, I know you have a panel after, I think if I'm not mistaken about cloud, and I think, look, I'm a big buyer of that, and I think it's a cornerstone of the modern technology. Is we many times machine learning, deep learning, language, natural language processing, AI are being thrown left, right, and center. I think the basis and the cornerstone for all that is really cloud computing, which allows to actually, run very, high scalability, across your processes in a very cost-effective way and in a very nimble way as well. So taking our approach, we took a very, we invested quite early in that area, as a business, but as well an organization. We are a big, believer in that, and we see it as the cornerstone, for anything that is scalable, anything that trade reporting and other stuff. So for me, it's a key part, and I think it's difficult to achieve, the requirement to meet the requirements of modern regulatory reporting without, embracing cloud computing. That's my thoughts.
No, okay, that's great. You mentioned benefits earlier of getting this right and taking a strategic approach. Can you kind of round those up and highlight the kinds of things that people can achieve?
Yeah, I think I touched upon the kind of the obvious one. So first there's definitely total cost of ownership, efficiency. For sure, it's kind of mutualized solution, for example. So if a client chooses a mutualized solution, that's what they can use. They're not just the only one bearing the cost of the solution. It's kind of a group of clients. I think it is as regulation and as fines as regulation is becoming more and more complex and as fines are getting more and more frequent, I think the safety numbers, argument is fairly, important. Safety numbers in a way that, you have other people that are, your peers in your sector that can, that make sure that, you're not missing something or you're not misinterpreting something. And the fact that as well, it would be hard for one institution to match, for example, our, the depth of our, SMEs on our side, because we service, hundreds of clients. So we have dozens of people across the globe, making sure that we are up to date to the latest, requirements. So that's another thing. And as we see as well that, that's the first obvious ones. Then the next one, and maybe spend a bit more time there, is the ability to benefit from, additional services. Like we talk about data lineage very briefly. It's really, we've seen, you know, across many of our clients that, you know, there is a need. Actually, let me flip that on its head. Lots of our clients, you know, spend a lot of time trying to understand what is not working. Essentially, when they figure out, you know, it's not too complicated to see that it's not going through, because you get, you know, an answer from the trade repository that tells you, no, I won't accept it as a first level. But they spend a lot of time trying to understand why it's not working. You know, where is the breakage? You know, somewhere. You know, and having clear data lineage and good visualization tool or good, you know, management tool as well of the reporting helps, you know, to be efficient around that and not, you know, spend countless of resources trying to figure out, you know, why X, Y, or Z field, you know, is not being accepted at the trade repository. That's kind of core reporting. Now that, you know, reporting quality is getting, you know, is being, you know, is a focus of the regulators and the market participant. It's even more important to benefit from these tools, because without them, you know, it's very hard to understand, you know, the completeness of your reporting, the accuracy as well, and the timeliness. You know, these are really important, you know, features of a regulatory reporting stack, you know, to ensure that, you know, you report correctly across the board.
Okay, we have only 1 minute left, so let me ask you an audience question, if I may, Pierre. And it says, it seems the IHS Markit is investing in regulatory reporting while we have seen several others exiting this business. What is it that you know that others don't?
It's an interesting question. Look, it's so that's my view. Okay, that's as I said, I think there is a premium in having modern technology at the heart of your solution. You know, I think we've seen, it's true, we've seen some departure, you know, from this industry, from other providers who somehow didn't manage to make the whole, you know, commercial model work. And I think, you know, generally is I'm not saying that's the only reason, but at the heart of it is the technology. What is your technology stack? Can you scale from it? Can you add hundreds of clients? Can you add, you know, thousands of more complex rules on top of it without, you know, challenging, without needing a complete re-architecture, which is very costly and very deadly for a provider. So I'm not pretending that we know more than the others. I think we have invested in the right, you know, approach, and with the right partners. We made some organic, you know, build, but as well we made some inorganic acquisition as well, you know, to build, you know, our solutions.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Pierre. And I think we'll have to end it there for today. So thank you very much indeed for some great insight into the move from tactical to strategic reporting and how you're doing it at IHS Markit. Thank you.
It's been helpful. Thank you very much.
Yeah, for sure.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Next, we move on to a panel on fulfilling the promise of Regtech in the cloud, which we just touched on, obviously, with Pierre. This panel will be moderated by Colin Gibson. Colin's background is in the technology side of investment banking. He was head of data architecture for global banking and markets at RBS and HSBC, and a head of enterprise architecture at Willis Towers Watson. That's a mouthful. He is the Ilium Council's product manager for both DCAM and the new cloud data management capabilities framework, which came out just a month or so ago. So, Colin, great to see you here, and my pleasure to hand this one over to you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and hello everyone. Welcome to our panel on fulfilling the promise of Regtech in the cloud. First of all, I'll kick off, ask our speakers to introduce themselves in a moment. But just a reminder to you all, please use the box on the right of the screen, the right of the video, to ask your questions and to vote in the poll questions. So welcome to our panel members, and I'll kick off by asking you for a short introduction about yourselves and your interest in regulatory change management. We'll be diplomatic and do this in alphabetical order, so we kick off with Ashok.
Thanks, Colin. Hello, everyone. Very happy to be here. My name is Ashok Mehta, and I'm head of equities regulatory reporting at Credit Suisse. I have about 20 years experience in the financial industry, and for past couple of years, we are very focused on transformation of our Regtech platforms to the cloud and leverage the agility and the efficiency it brings. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashok. Next, we have Ben.
Hi, I, like Ashok, have got 20 years experience in financial services working with data. I'm an independent data and architecture leader. In the Regtech space, some of the work that I've done was as the global business architect for HSBC's financial intelligence unit, and later the architect for their financial crime threat mitigation capability. I was later the global head of business data architecture for the investment bank, and most recently I led a sub-capability of the CDMC at the EDM Council. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. We'll continue to play longevity top trumps and see if David can top your experience. So David, next.
I can't. I have no experience managing data. My name is David Eric, and I'm the Executive Director of AIR, the Alliance for Innovative Regulation. And we are a nonprofit organization that works at this intersection between technology, innovation, and regulation. And of course, the issue of regulation is critical to cloud development, cloud adoption, because we can only go as fast as the regulators are comfortable. So very happy to be here and looking forward to a very robust conversation.
Colin, you're mute.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I've got it. Thank you. Last but not least, we have Harpreet.
Hi, thank you. So my name is Harpreet, and I had middle and back office consulting, which also includes Regtech within DXC Luxsoft. Previous to Luxsoft, I managed regulatory teams at organizations such as UBS, Deutsche Bank, Citi, to name a few, which has included, setting up teams, designing reg architecture, and eventually driving compliance. Thank you.
Thanks, Harpreet. So great to have you all here. So we're going to open with an audience poll question and invite the audience to cast your vote. The question, if we could get the poll up and running, there it is what do you consider to be the biggest technology-related risk around adopting a cloud-based Regtech solution in your organization? So your options, is it meeting regulatory requirements such as data privacy, data security, cybersecurity? Is it integration with legacy systems and architectures, or is it the risk of working with an unproven solution? Lots of rich opportunities to choose from there. So while the audience vote on that, let's get underway with the panel question. So let's kick off. As financial institutions advance their Regtech strategy and adopt more cloud-based solutions, what are the technology-related risks that are of most concern? So Ashok, perhaps you could lead off on this.
Yeah, Colin, I think in my experience, we are still, I think the data security and the data privacy, I think in my mind still remains the biggest sort of concerns when we think about any sort of a platform or a data migration to the cloud. Let me say that it's not that, the cloud technology is not, yet there in terms of providing the right level of controls or, the frameworks, but it is more to do with the comfort level which, let's say, our clients or the institutions or the regulators themselves have, putting any kind of, private or confidential data in the cloud. I think that kind of remains a concern, and that becomes sort of a biggest challenge when you are thinking about like any of your solutions. So I think as an industry, we have to mature more in terms of coming up with the right, either the controls or the processes or the certifications, which, can kind of prove that, hey, the platform meets the required standards. I think that is something we have to continue to build on. And give that level of comfort which everybody needs to kind of enable more cloud-based solutions.
Yes, that's a great point, Ashok. We've heard people say that organizations have spent years perfecting their controls on premises, and they all of a sudden instantly need to have the same controls as they move to cloud. Harpreet, perhaps you can add to any comments on the biggest risks.
Yeah, I think Ashok is spot on that data privacy and security concerns are inherent risk with any cloud migration. On top of that, just specific more to Regtech, there's IT program execution risk, because if your new Regtech solution is expected to comply with certain regulations before a certain date that regulators may have imposed, you need to make sure that it is ready by that date, right? So that is always there. And with cloud-based solutions, with people still not very experienced with some of those, it always takes a little bit longer than what people have planned. Then another one is just the strategic risk of IT. The model you have chosen for your Regtech cloud-based solution, does that align with your strategic IT direction? So those are the other risks.
Okay, that's very good. Let's see what the audience thinks. So Sarah, could you put up the poll results? So here we have it. I'll give you all a minute to digest that. Interesting, cybersecurity, no concern to anybody, and nobody concerned about working with unproven solutions, and everything else pretty equal. David, any thoughts or observations on what you see in these?
Well, it looks like the results are still coming in, so they're in real time, which is great. There's no question that regulatory requirements is a major concern. Google did a very interesting survey of financial institutions, and they found that 83% of financial institutions report deploying some part of their operations in the cloud, and yet 78% of them actually recognize that regulatory uncertainty prevents adoption of the cloud, which is a very interesting dynamic. The other element that you see here is the incredible challenge of integration with legacy systems, and that challenge is not only how hard it is to integrate with legacy systems, but also the incredible risk that's associated with it as well. So the results are very interesting in the sense that the audience isn't feeling particularly concerned about cybersecurity and the risk of working with an unproven solution, perhaps because the cloud at this point isn't unproven. But those are some of my early thoughts, Colin.
Right, so very good. So given the risks, how should financial institutions manage that migration from legacy technology to the cloud? At what cost and at what risk? Harpreet, perhaps you could pick up on that.
Yeah, I mean, we saw 38% of the audience poll said they are concerned about integration with legacy systems and architecture. And I think, and when you look at the problem as a whole, there are three areas of consideration. You need to look at your own firm and its strategy. You need to look at the solution you are choosing, and then to an extent also look at what regulators are comfortable with. So when it comes to your own firm and strategy, do you have a policy? Do you have a governance in place? What kind of experience do you have in space? Nature of your systems, they're legacy, but legacy can mean many things, right? So how legacy are they? And finally, also, I think, why are you moving to cloud-based Regtech solution? What is the value add? Is it regulatory compliance, or is it also to drive some kind of business value at a later stage? So you need to, as a whole, look at where your firm is heading towards and shape that. Then the second aspect, like I said, is the solution you choose. And solution is combination of your own firm, it's the cloud hosting provider, and maybe a vendor. So then you need to look at things such as, is your cloud hosting provider or providers, they are working for all your regions where you need to be compliant. Do your vendor have experience with this type of thing? Are your vendors cloud agnostic? This is important for you. And then how easy it is to integrate and migrate the data. So you'll do at least one data migration, maybe more dependent on regulation you are going to comply with. So all of these things need to be looked at. And then how comfortable is regulator? You need to speak to the authorities in the regions that you're working in to make sure they are comfortable with the idea of moving to a cloud-based solution. I think it's also the second part of question, at what cost and risks. Risks are obviously what Ashok was talking about, cloud security, data security, but with many of the latest solutions and careful planning, those can be mitigated. Cost is more difficult question to solve because it depends on the individual situation of your firm. But but like I was saying, the business case that you have, if it is, I shouldn't say just about, but if it is about regulatory compliance only, and you're not able to derive business value, sometimes it's difficult to create a business case and justify it. So it should always look at deriving business value out of the data that you're going to put on the cloud for the Regtech solutions.
And Colin, I think I would just jump in here and add that when you think about the capabilities of some of the new technologies like AI and the privacy enhancing technologies, the requirement of being on the cloud is just evident. There's no way to implement many of these new technologies if you're not operating on the cloud. So it's a real fundamental requirement to really move into modern digital technology.
So you'd almost position it as table stakes nowadays, that you need to be there. Okay, Ben, your thoughts on how you manage the migration?
Fantastic. Well, look, I think Harpreet gave a very comprehensive answer to that, and I guess the only things that I would probably add are in terms of the kind of risks that you're going to manage when you're interacting with a vendor, and there are obviously Regtech cloud-based software as a service type of vendors, then you are deferring that risk to the vendor's controls, and therefore it's very important to fully understand how they're managing your data on your behalf. I know that not all vendors necessarily expose their data models and the metadata that they're storing associated with that and the necessary access and controls, etc. So it's very important to have a really good grip of what you're going into and how your data is being managed on your behalf. So I guess that was something Harpreet touched on, but just to go into a little bit more detail.
Ben, is that what people refer to as the shared responsibility model and needing to be clear about who does what?
Absolutely. And having a really good understanding. Some of the ways you can control that is to have a really good process internally of sending data externally, either to vendors or to cloud or to both, and to ensure that each at each stage you're looking at what those controls are and have periodic review of those to make sure that they're managing your information according to your risk appetite.
Yeah. So with your architecture hat on then, Ben, what are some of the key architecture decisions and the technology choices that companies are faced with and need to make?
Fantastic. Well, look, architecture is entirely informed by business strategy. So it should not be the other way around. So the organization needs to be, as mentioned previously, very clear about what it is trying to get out of the cloud. Going to the cloud is a choice, and not all firms actually, interestingly, are fully embracing that as a choice. But in terms of what it offers is sort of great ability to blend data at speed and to be able to deploy very consistent controls associated with data because you're on a more consistent environment. So these are some of the things, but actually in terms of what can go wrong, it can go wrong very fast if those controls aren't in place as well. So the other thing is to understand what regulatory requirements there are going to the cloud, and portability is a key one, so that organizations aren't fully dependent on one cloud provider, and regulation is really focusing on ensuring that there is that kind of resilience across multi-cloud. So of course that is a very important decision, and although many of the cloud offerings offer similar types of computing capability and storage capability, they're not identical, and therefore the architectural decisions you have to make in terms of portability and which vendors are going to be able to assist you in ensuring that you can move from one cloud vendor to another as required.
So Ben, let's build on that one a little bit. Does that mean that you have to do double implementations, or does it mean that you have to have desktop tested the ability to move? How far would you take it, or how far
I think, well, look, I think it's the latter, and of course it gets more complicated. So I don't think you necessarily have to have deployed in 2 environments to be able to do that. I think you have to ensure that you have a plan, you have the capability, and you've tested it regularly to ensure that that is. Now, the other thing is, as with all contingency, an allowable sort of change in service is it may be within your risk appetite. So you could say, look, for the period that we're on this alternate service, but potentially we would manage it in a slightly different manner. It doesn't have to be exactly like for like, but you do have to have consciously decided how you're going to manage, what your risk appetite for that is, and how you're going to manage it in terms of complexity.
Right. So Ashok, from your point of view, what key decisions and technology choices have you seen having to be made?
Sure, I think the Van was spot on pointing out some of these challenges. And when we talk about architecture, I mean, yeah, the business strategy is the key in terms of what real benefit you're trying to drive. But at the same time, I think like a lot of people, when they think about cloud, they simply think that, hey, cloud is going to be cheaper, which definitely will not be the case. Like if you do not manage it correctly. Because flexibility can very easily turn into like the cost overhead if you do not have the proper controls in place, which I think Ben was kind of alluding to. But I think it also like there are a number of considerations which you need to start with, right? First of all, like, okay, what problem or the data you're trying to solve, and those could have legal and regulatory implications of like where that data can be actually hosted. So you need to start off like, okay, what a cloud provider and what kind of their availability zones you want to host this data. I mean, I think that's kind of first consideration goes into. Then you have to think about, hey, what kind of processes or the controls you have in place to protect that data. You can also think of whether you're going to build your own solution or you can use some off-the-shelf solutions. Then what type of platform model you're going to use, whether it's a SaaS or a PaaS or IaaS. So like a lot of those considerations, I think, has to go before you actually start on that journey. But I think Ben's point about interoperability was very valid. Like when you build it, your first step is to basically migrate your application onto the cloud. But then you have to also make sure that you are not kind of tied to that provider or the vendor. And you need to have interoperability to be able to exit out of it when there need be. And I think those are some of the key things you have to do very early when you start planning about this journey.
Very good. We've actually got a very good question from the audience. So let's take this one at this point, which is, how do we make sure the cloud does not become another big cost center? Anybody want to pick up on that?
Fantastic. Look, I think this is a great question, and actually I'm going to sort of reference what Ashok said there, which is that there is generally a perception that one entirely replaces CapEx with OpEx in this type of in a cloud migration or the utilization of cloud. It's rarely the case that CapEx goes away, and that OpEx is actually notoriously unpredictable in terms of the bursts of usage, computing and storage, depending on the cost model of the cloud. So one of the things that I would recommend is, as part of the business strategy of going to the cloud, is to be very clear associated with what controls you're putting in place and measures associated with the cloud usage, and to monitor that very carefully. Your architectural decisions, and not only in terms of which cloud providers you're using and which transport vendors that you're using between those clouds as well, will determine how expensive this is, both in a short-term and a longer-term basis. So actually including in your outcomes and your governance really close scrutiny of the costs associated with the OpEx expenditure on cloud is one of the ways that you can manage that carefully.
And I guess that comes back to architecture decisions again as well. I mean, I know in CDMC, in the Cloud Data Management Capability Framework, we have a capability all around facilitating cost optimization for precisely that point. You need to be on top of it, and you need to be able to optimize and control.
Absolutely, and yes, I fully agree. It's just using the CDMC framework around that is a powerful way of implementing it.
So, thank you for that one, Ben. Looking at the environment, I mean, it's probably rare or maybe impossible that organizations will immediately go to just having a cloud environment. So you're talking hybrid clouds, you're talking multi-clouds. So integration and interoperability becomes key. And of course, integration and interoperability is always a challenge, and can be a challenge in working with Regtech and cloud-based solutions. So any advice from the panel on how to manage that, and what approaches and technologies can help with integration and interoperability? Maybe one for Ashok to start with again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the interoperability, is the key, as we were saying before, to avoid a vendor lock and also have the capability to be able to have an exit strategy for you. But whenever we think about implementing any Regtech solution, I think one of the key things is how we are going to integrate it with our, sort of on-prem legacy platforms or the data feed providers. So I think that's where, like, having some kind of a standardization and the data models which lend to sort of easy, integration with various Regtech solutions, I think is definitely the key. And I think we as an industry has to sort of mature. Although I think in the financial sector, we have standards like FIX, which fall more on the trading side. I think we have to come up with a kind of a similar standards, for the other parts of, the organization, like where we deal with like regulatory solutions and things like that. So I think that is one key. But then other than that, I think what we were talking about, like when we think about, making the architecture decision, what technology platform to choose, I think you should always think about like the platforms which are more interoperable, either across different solution providers or even the cloud providers. So I think that is key. Or sometimes, you can also stick with some open source frameworks which are widely adopted across different platforms. So I think those are some of the key things I would suggest from my end.
So look for open standards and make it a selection criterion. That's what the key message there. Yeah.
I agree.
David, any thoughts from you? What you're seeing?
Well, sorry, that's me. I
was going to David. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, David, please.
But Ben, jump in. Do you have something to add?
Well, I just wanted to say, in terms of integration with legacy systems, some of the things that you can do is ensure that you're sort of using virtualization technology and creating enterprise-wide data assets in the cloud. That's a really powerful way of ensuring that their legacy systems can integrate with modern cloud service providers, and also consistency of data across the organization. So I'm a great believer in enterprise-wide data assets as a means of extensibility of an architecture. Thanks, David. Sorry.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And when you think about what's possible with the cloud, you're really starting to think about the future of digital applications and the future of digital regulation, right? What's possible, what's made possible through the cloud is the opportunity to create new platform interoperability and to create new interoperability between the Regtech platforms that large financial institutions may be looking at. If you think about some of the challenges of being able to leverage Regtechs, which we've talked about today, the challenge of opening up legacy systems. One of the challenges that you have with Regtech solutions is that they're single point solutions, and large financial institutions are really looking for end-to-end solutions. It's very hard for them to cost justify and take on the risk of opening the box for the legacy system for just one single point solution of a Regtech. By being able to build and operate in the cloud, you could imagine a future where you have almost an app store of Regtechs, right? Where the Regtechs are each coding to the interoperable APIs of the cloud for the financial institution, and they're coding to each other. So a financial institution would be able, with one integration, be able to select from a handful of Regtechs that provide a suite of services. So it's a very, as you start to think about the art of the possible, the cloud enables a whole new world. It enables a whole new vision of how we could be approaching our regulatory and compliance requirements.
And hopefully simplification behind all of that, yeah.
That's the promise of technology, is to bring scale at almost no cost, at no incremental cost, and at the same time increase our efficiency and our effectiveness. When you think about the outcomes of financial regulation, it's outcomes that we all support, right? We're talking about consumer protection. We're talking about safety and soundness of the system. We're talking about the stopping financial crime. These are all goals that are enabled by regulation. But at the moment, we're not able to achieve the highest effectiveness of being able to leverage our technology to meet the solutions that will help us achieve those goals. And the cloud is a very important step in being able to really create the regulatory system of the future.
Thanks, David. So there is another audience question, but I'm going to ask a different question first because I think it may lead into it. So how important is the need for good, sound data management practices to underpin the adoption of cloud-based Regtech solutions? And what are some of the key differences there between sound data management on-prem and sound data management in the cloud, if in fact there are any differences? Harpreet, what's your view on that?
I'll say very important to start with. So we have to, and a lot of us now understand the rules around security and data integrity of data. They're different on cloud as compared to on-prem. So, as an example, when data is managed on-prem, you have full control of not only your data, but your tech stack, performance, etc. are local. And it is probably easier to comply with some of the regulations such as GDPR because you know where the data is sitting. And when we talk about cloud now, suddenly data management is not a product, it's a service, right? Because you can add resources, you get some services which are inbuilt, some access control which is inbuilt. So you don't have to design them, which is good part, but at the same time you need to know what you are going to use and how does it apply to you. And if you're not doing that carefully, you may end up with a solution which is not fit for your firm. So because of that, now we definitely need different data management practices, but also probably stronger. Simple things such as data at transit, now is going through the cloud, to the wider sort of networks, right? And data at rest is stored in the cloud and not necessarily in one of your local drives. And bringing the Regtech to this equation, where there could be, a requirement from the authorities to publish the data to wider public or to authorities and mask certain data. So you actually need an additional layer of oversight on the data that you are sending across the network, right? So it becomes paramount that people, when they are looking at the cloud Regtech, they also look at their current data management practices and how they fit.
So Ben, I'll ask you to build on that a little bit, but so the audience question that maybe you can work into that is, can you expand on how to manage the jurisdictional challenges of working with different cloud providers in different locations?
Okay, so that works beautifully, actually. Yes. I fully agree with what Harpreet said about, data management is actually more important in the cloud than on-prem. And part of this is because, as the question obviously implies, data can be in many different locations in the cloud. It's probably more limited in its regional possibilities when it's on-prem. So understanding your data and in terms of where it comes from, what type of data it is in terms of categorization or cataloging and classification is extremely critical. And obviously understanding from an ownership perspective who is responsible for ensuring that data is sound, it becomes even more important. And then you use that metadata to be able to determine how regulatory requirements interlay with that. If you think of regulatory requirements almost as business logic that would be sitting on top of that metadata, you can say, okay, well, this is data of this type from this region, originating in this region. It has to be stored in this particular manner, and that you can actually build into your transport mechanism and controls in terms of access around the world, that logic and the metadata together. But that's only if you have sound data management to the point where your metadata is reliable enough for you to be able to use that logic. And therefore, data management is arguably even more important in the cloud than on-prem.
So on the jurisdictional challenges, it's know what the rules are, know what your data is, and know where your data is. And if you can combine those three things, you've got the ability to manage those challenges.
I think that's right. And actually, I mean, increasingly you see legal counsel and data privacy experts, working hand in hand with the metadata parts of the organization, where that legal counsel determines exactly what the requirements are that get translated into business logic that sits over the metadata requirements. And so it really is a synergistic and very important relationship there.
Great, thank you, Ben. So let's talk about some real examples if you have them. Can you share any use case examples of good Regtech, cloud-based Regtech deployments and what the outcome of doing that was? Ashok, any good examples?
Sure. So in my world, I think we started this journey to the public cloud like a couple of years ago. And of course, there were a lot of challenges when we started. So I will give you an example, like all of our equities regulatory transaction reporting, we used to do from our on-prem platform, which was old IBM Netezza-based appliance we used to use. And obviously, I think the challenges which we had with it was like not only we had to deal with every now and then end-of-life remediation, but we had a lot of capacity concerns with it as well. And our business case was mainly, to be able to deal with that capacity constraints as needed, right? Because the markets kind of spike, our trading volumes go through the roof. And that's when we need to be able to, scale it on a very short time frame and be able to still meet our regulatory requirements. So that was the business case. And we started that journey and we have successfully migrated this platform from on-prem. And today, like we do all of our regulatory reporting for equities from our public cloud-based platform which we have built. And recently we have also deployed, the CAT, which is a consolidated audit trail regulation through this platform on the public cloud. And, we have reaped some benefits from it as well. Like, back last year in March when, the markets have really spiked, we were able to handle like 3 times the volumes of our usual average. And we were able to, scale the platform on the fly. And that's like one example, I would say, like how the cloud can kind of pay off.
Fantastic. There must be a lot of people getting much more sleep than they used to get. If that's the case.
Definitely.
Okay, Harpreet, from what you see with your clients, any examples?
Yeah, so we have looked at some clients who've gone hybrid versus full cloud solution versus, where the reg was one aspect of a wider cloud-based solution. The key thing is if you're not careful, it always takes longer than you anticipate because there are nuances of cloud, right? So I think needs to keep that in mind, especially if you're an organization who you may understand your solution and regulation very well, but organizationally, if you do not have a lot of experience with the cloud, then you may want to pick something small and build on top of that, or get some help if that's the case, right? So, but if you're going a full scale reporting as a service type of solution, it is very important. I think somebody touched upon this previously. Where is your responsibility versus the responsibility of the vendor or the cloud-based hosting provider you have chosen? So, but once all of this is done, people generally are happier than they were before because it does reduce the amount of activity you have to do on an on-prem solution versus a cloud-based solution.
And it's probably stating the obvious, Harvey, but that the old adage around that about you can outsource responsibility, but you can't outsource accountability. Presumably, you still see that apply.
Yes, yeah. And with Regtech, actually, many a times regulators have they talk about that in the regulatory text as well, right? So it doesn't matter who the vendor is, the responsibility may lie actually on the bank or whosoever is supposed to be reporting.
Great, thank you. We're in the last 5 minutes or so, and there are no more audience questions. So just to start the closing up and summing up, can you share some best practice approaches for making Regtech delivery in the cloud a success, and key considerations for turning that into a successful partnership? So Harpreet, maybe you can continue on that.
So I'll say understand your data architecture, including your data governance. So kind of touching upon what I said before, including your data governance processes. Make sure you understand where your data is coming from, where it is going, and have a process, a control process around it. That once you are about to go live with the cloud-based solution, and if you do not understand many of these integrations, they always cause a problem in terms of testing and also actually in terms of being compliant with the regulation.
A very key message. Ben, what's your view about best practices for success?
Well, I think it's sort of consolidating much of what was said, which is effectively, ensure that you are absolutely in control of what you're trying to achieve by using cloud as opposed to on-prem, and that you have appropriate outcomes laid out and governed and measured, including the cost and the risk that you're trying to control there. And that way you can actually determine how you're going to, whether you're hitting those goals, or you need to address them and change your approach appropriately, ensure that governance is strong and permanent. I think then it's a case of having set up a really robust, strong framework is to actually start small, and with the use cases that are going to give the maximum benefit to you. So many regulations based on the same types of data assets. So if you actually, client, for example, as a data asset is one of the easiest ones to focus on and will give the biggest bang for buck. So if you can work out how you're going to sort of expand on that with each iterative deliverable, then you're building on success within a very fixed framework of governance.
Great, thank you, Ben. Ashok, your final thoughts on best practices for success?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it, as Ben also said, I think the strong data governance is quite important, because as we were saying that, like, once it's not about like deploying a one small solution in cloud. It is more about, hey, like how you can use it at a bigger scale. And I think any data you push it to the cloud and you do something with it, you need to make sure that you can drive some value out of it. And that's where the data governance and the controls become very important, a part of it. And second thing I think would be, like there is a lot of new technology and buzzwords in cloud which keep coming up. So I would say, like, don't get, sort of worried in all of that. And you should kind of really focus on your use case and see like what technology and a platform really makes sense for you and how you want to kind of build and architect it. So that is quite important.
Great, yeah. David, I think earlier you raised the sort of the optimistic view of the art of the possible. I mean, what message would you like to leave people with in terms of that art of the possible? An optimistic close.
I think the cloud is the future. The future of banking, the future of compliance, the future of regulation. And so I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to understand what the cloud is and to start to experiment with it. I think that there is a huge opportunity to start small and think big, right? Understand that your actions have huge implications, but start small, pick a single project and move forward. Make a commitment and execute.
Great, thank you, David. So there's no more questions from the audience. Anybody got any final thoughts? I think we can wrap. We got the next panel ready to go. But if there's anything anybody would like to throw in just as a final thought. here's a quick opportunity.
Well, we're seeing a focus on standards and financial services coming together with cloud providers to be able to determine those standards. And so I would keep a close eye on initiatives like the CDMC and others that are enabling people to be able to have a standard way of managing these types of issues and interacting on them. And I think increasingly we're going to see vendors adopting those, and that's going to be hugely beneficial in terms of how people can grow and interact with certainty on these technologies. So
no, thank you for that, Ben. I'll add to that plug for CDMC. If people in the audience haven't seen it already or don't know about it, go to edmconsole.org and you'll see a section on CDMC. It's a free license resource. Anybody's able to download it and use it internally. And as Ben said, there's great interest in it. The market is gaining a lot of traction. So with that,
Colin, I will just add that like no matter what the challenges are, I think the cloud for Regtech is inevitable. So embrace it.
Absolutely. So thank you, everybody. That was a great discussion. Hopefully the audience got value from it, and thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to your panel, who have certainly future a comprehensive review of where we are now in terms of cloud and on our journey. So thank you indeed for that.
Thank you.
Next, I'd like to introduce Corp ID, a Regtech startup that will share a short video with us.
Hi. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to introduce Corp ID. My name is Job den Hamer and I'm the CEO of this fantastic company. Customer due diligence is a necessary and time-consuming process where we have to deal with regulatory changes almost daily that all of us, corporates, financial institutions and their business partners need to comply with. Let me show you how we simplify the KYC process.
Corp ID is a single digital vault to collect, organize and track your KYC documents. It enables easy collaboration internally and externally with your business partners. You always remain in control of your information by giving consented access to your business partner, and they remain up to date with the latest information you publish.
Let's create a worldwide standard for KYC regulations. Join us on our mission to simplify KYC.
Well, thank you for that little intermission, shall we call it? And let's move on. I'd like to introduce James Hardy, Technical Product Manager at Univista and LSEG Business, who will present a keynote on the EMEA refit from the trenches, progress so far and challenges ahead. This is often a regulation that comes up, and the problems with the refit seem to be quite considerable. Let me introduce you to James, if I may. James has 10 years of reg reporting experience on both sides of the fence, 5 years in the reg reporting change space of a German investment bank, and 5 years in the product management of an ESMA licensed trade repository. So James, with all that experience and lots of understanding of the EMEA refit, let me hand over to you for the keynote.
Thanks, Sarah, and hi everyone. Thank you very much for attending today's session on this lovely Wednesday afternoon. As we just heard, my name is James Hardy and I'm the product manager for EMEA at Univista. I'm currently trying to, spending an awful lot of time and effort trying to make sense of EMEA refit. So on a whole, it's fairly welcome and a well-received initiative. The alignment to the global CDE standards, the harmonization of reporting and reconciliation approaches, and a lot of the other changes are really positive signals, which will hopefully do two things. One, reduce the cost for reporting firms to report, and two, simultaneously improve the data quality for the supervising authority. So if we just have a quick look at the agenda and move on in the presentation. Next slide. Here we go. I'll give you a quick overview of the roles and responsibilities of a trade repository, the function we fulfill in the wider context of transaction reporting and just a general high-level overview of what it is that we do. We'll then dive into refit, discuss what we know to date, and then go into more detail on what we are still waiting to be specified. Across the board, the absence of the more nuanced requirements can make planning and estimating very difficult. We'll run through some of the challenges we as the industry face, and we will conclude with a quick outlook on the road ahead. So this presentation will take roughly 15 minutes, and I think we'll have 5 minutes for some Q&A at the end of this. So if we just jump onto the next slide, thank you. So the role of a TR, whereas we share many of the challenges with the industry, the experience of a trade repository undergoing reg change can at times be rather different than the ones of reporting firms, where reporting firms spend an awful lot of time understanding and defining and tracing data points through their system landscape. The main function of a TR involves around processing and preparing large amounts of data, creating statistics and views, and there are, broadly speaking, 4 different stakeholder groups within the world of a TR, and each of them have equally different needs. And we have on one side the reporting firms, which are our clients. Then we have the authorities who are the subscribers to our data feeds. We have the wider inter-TR community, who are essentially our competitors, and we have the public. So clients typically want us to consume, process and validate their data, make sure it's secure, have appropriate access management in place, and return views and reports to them showing the data that we hold for them. So that's a very different set of requirements than that of regulators, for instance, who will want to access this information. They will want to see reports we receive from our clients. We want to see the latest version of anything that is outstanding on any given date. They want statistics on rejections and reconciliations. They want us to calculate the exposure between counterparties for different sets of fungible instruments. And they want all of that data filtered based on their mandates, so that only really information reaches them that is really relevant to them. So the third stakeholder group really is the inter-TR community, and they want information on the trades that we have. EMI as a dual-sided reporting regime was a requirement to reconcile both sides of a trade. So we interact with the community across other functions as well, such as portability. This is where firms switch TR service providers. And where they switch service providers, there's a regulator prescribed process that needs to be followed, whereby we move the outstanding trade population from one TR to the other, so that there's no requirement for clients to back report or re-report their transactions, and they can just seamlessly continue sending update messages on their existing trade population. So those are the kind of information that the other TRs want. And finally, the last stakeholder group in the world of a TR is the public. We have a requirement to make aggregate information available to the public. So this is essentially showing the public the size of both the OTC and the ETD market. So that's aggregated notionals, number of trades, and we split that by different asset classes so that the public understands how big the entire market is. So I will stop here on essentially the roles of a TR, and I'd ask you, Sarah, to jump onto the next slide if that's possible. So refit the knowns. A lot is known about refit at this point, and we usually split the requirements into 4 main pillars: client submissions, reconciliations, data access, and the processes. There is some major change to the client submissions. The list of reportable fields is significantly increasing. The field definitions will be aligned to the global CDE standards. That's the critical data element standards. New fields like the UPI will be required, and the submission channels will be harmonized. So all reports need to be submitted in ISO 222 XML standards. And that is fairly different to the current state where essentially TRs can gold plate their submission standards, and each and every TR have ever so nuanced differences. So this alignment of the reporting firms will also make switching between TR providers a lot more easy for the reporting firms, and thereby creating more competition between us, because the hurdle for moving between TRs is going to be reduced. Alongside with the messages that we receive from the clients, the feedback that we send to clients will be harmonized. There's going to be 6 predefined end-of-day reports that TRs will need to provide to clients. So there are minimum requirements and minimum standards of information that a reporting firm can expect to receive from TRs. So this, on a whole, is going to make the approach a lot more harmonized between all of us. There's an overhaul of the reconciliations. Much of it stays the same though, and under the current RTS, the inter-TR community is responsible to come up for the process of reconciliations, but under refit, it is ESMA who have to manage the requirements of reconciliation. So whereas they adopt an awful lot of what currently is in place, the fact that they now have to, the fact that they now have the mandate to design this process makes that part in the final report so large, even though the changes itself are not quite as major. So there are changes. Obviously, the field list is changing, so are the reconcilable fields, and there are certain discussions about snapshots, but those are not the knowns, those are the unknowns that we're going to jump in quite soon. In the interest of time, the other 2 points that need to change is around data access and processes. Now, I'll keep these very short because this is essentially more relevant for TRs than for reporting firms. And that is not quite true, but there will be impact on you, but there are certain processes like LEI changes, portability that will have to be facilitated by TRs, which I will keep as short as I just did so that we can move on to the next slide, Sarah. Thank you. So moving on to the agenda, the most obvious of areas of uncertainty is that of the timeline. We've been expecting the European Commission to endorse refit since Q2 this year, but I've not heard much since from ESMA. Equally, on the other side, the FCA haven't made any statement in that respect yet, so we are unclear about when exactly these new rules come into force and whether the dates will be harmonized across the EU and UK, or if we will see these staggered over a yet undefined time period. Hand in hand with that comes the uncertainty around FCA divergence. In what capacity these changes will be adopted in the UK is unclear at this point. The FCA is yet to publish detailed requirements. There's a risk in that. I think a lot of us are hoping that we can repurpose the efforts we're doing in the EU for the UK, but there is a conceivable scenario where these divergences are significant and those jurisdictions will have their own bespoke and super complex requirements. So that's a huge part of uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty around the lower level requirements of the submission formats. We are waiting for the final ISO 222 XML standards, the validation rules, the error codes, all of that is still outstanding. ESMA have said that they would provide this no later than 12 months prior to the go live, which means that getting information on this might still be quite far away, actually. There are other clarifications pending. For instance, questions around the lifecycle sequencing and the use of the event time. So essentially, is it possible to back report events, so out of sequence reporting, or is it the reporting timestamp as it stands today? ESMA have said that they would provide clarity on the sequencing of life cycles and whether the possibility of back reporting events is an option, but we are still waiting to hear back on that, and it will have a major impact on how we report and how we receive reports as a TR. The other part that is being discussed at the moment is reconciliations and the snapshots used for them. Just looking how we have the time. Currently, the latest states of any records are reported. The proposal was made to reconcile on T+2. So the rationale behind that is position level reports, for instance, change on a daily basis. So it's the end of day position and it will change. Depending on whether it is reported on T or T+1 by the counterparties, certain mismatches might be unavoidable. So where one counterparty reports on T and the other counterparty reports on T+1, These reports will never match because every day they will have to send an update, and every day the notional amount, for instance, is changing. So the proposal, therefore, is to create a snapshot on T+2, to wait for all the report submissions to have been made, and then reconcile a snapshot that is 2 days old. We are still waiting to hear back from ESMA on this, but it will have a major impact on how we reconcile, and there's simply no clarification on that yet. So, Sarah, I think that's that on this slide, if we just move along. So, as to the challenges. High level of unknowns makes planning difficult and increases the risk for under-delivering. Moving timeframes impact project planning and resourcing. It really doesn't allow for early preparations in that sense. There's overlaps with other reporting regimes. CFTC, there's a review from MIFIA, and that will create challenges for the resources and firms. The divergence between ESMA and the FCA is expected to some degree, and it will make it really difficult for companies that have dual reporting obligations under both, having to fit two potentially diverging regulations into a very into the same time frame. We have made a market survey, and it kind of suggested that up to 40% of the firms we have been speaking to have not actually yet started preparing for refit, and a lot of it probably is dependent. A lot of the reason for that is probably the lack of clarity and the requirements that we're still waiting for. If we just jump to the next slide. So the other challenges we are having are to some extent data related. The UPI is going to be a mandatory field. It's a field that doesn't exist at the moment, and there are concerns about the timing and the availability of the reference data being made available in time for reporting. There's technical challenges around the creation of XML messages. A lot of firms struggle with the technology needed for it, especially smaller firms that are not quite as sophisticated in technology will have issues for it. There's problems that will arise from the transition period. So there's going to be a 6-month window where all outstanding trades will have to be upgraded to the new reporting format. That means that the additional data points that EMEA refit need will have to be back reported, and especially where these have to be captured at trade execution, it may be very difficult for firms to retrospectively provide us this data because it wasn't captured at trade execution. So that is a fairly difficult challenge for the firms reporting to us. The last one created by the transition period is, of course, the mismatches that will have to be expected during the reconciliation of new and old formats. So where one slide is still in the old format and the other side in the new format, these will naturally not match. So as you can see, there's an awful lot of challenges that the industry will have to face. There is time to prepare for it, but it's not as easy. So just jumping, I think we're slowly running out of time. So if we just jump to the last slide for a quick view ahead, we are expecting the European Commission to endorse the refit in this quarter, which would essentially mean that there would be a go live in Q2 2023. Now, there's no guarantee for that. That might very well slip. If this endorsement materializes, we would have to expect the Swift ISIN messages to be published, including the ESMA validation rules, no later than Q2 2022. In Q3 2022, we are expecting an FCA policy statement, and that would then essentially clarify when and what will happen with go live with the FCA, where we don't quite have as much clarity. So if all of these previous points materialize, we will see a go live in Q2 2023 for the ESMA part of it. The transition period will start, and the transition period will stop in Q4 2023, as of when all the open trades have to be upgraded. So I'm going to pause here because I think we are out of time, and I will open it up for questions.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, James. And let me also welcome Emma Barber, Senior Business Analyst at Univista, who will join us in answering a couple of audience questions. And I have a couple here. And the first is, you decide who answers them, okay? Do you have any insight into how closely the FCA will or will not align with ESMA in their requirements on EMIR refit? Who'd like to take that one?
So I must say, we do not. So we have responded to a questionnaire from the FCA asking an awful lot of questions. They seem to be in the process of collecting information rather than sharing information yet to make informed decisions. So we at this point can't make any statement in reference to how closely aligned these are.
Okay.
Please jump in if you.
I completely agree, but just to add to that, we are expecting a consultation paper from the FCA. It was anticipated in October, so hopefully within the next coming weeks, which would hopefully give us some more clarity on that.
Right, as you said, a lot of known unknowns still, so perhaps too early, perhaps to say much about that. The next one is a little bit more technical, and I will read it to you. The adoption of ISO 20022 as the industry data standard is being implemented to move to a harmonized and consistent approach for EMIR reporting. Adopting these standards creates further cost and complexity. Do you have advice for implementing the standards correctly?
So this is an issue that affects a lot of clients. There will be service providers out there that will help with certain technical aspects, and there's going to be safety in numbers using certain service providers that essentially provide CSV to XML conversion. So for less technically sophisticated clients, there will be people in the market who will be providing CSV to XML conversion. It will be a standardized product that multiple clients are using, and therefore there's a herd knowledge. Well, yeah, the more people use a system, the more mature and the more reliable it becomes.
Okay, Emma, would you like to add to that in terms of ISO 20022?
No, I think James has covered that quite well. It is, as we know, going to be a challenge for a number of people, a number of firms, but there will be support available. And obviously, as a TR as well, we'll be working closely with ESMA and the FCA to try and get any clarity that we can, and obviously pass that on to our clients around how to populate those XML messages.
Very much. I think we're out of time now, so we'll have to leave it there, but I hope to have you back sometime soon as the refit sort of takes a bit of a better shape for everybody with more of those knowns in place. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, let me now move on to our next panel, which will consider managing trade and communication surveillance in the new world of work, by which we mean, I guess, some of us at home, some in the office, some remote, some in the office, a mixture of all those things put together. It will be moderated by Matthew Bernstein, Information Governance Strategist at MC Bernstein Data. Matthew was, I should say, the founder of MC Bernstein Data, and he led information practices in various global financial services businesses and was Deutsche Bank's Group Information and Records Management Lead. He now supports companies in meeting the significant and increasing information governance risks they face by changing the way systems and people manage information. That's just a little bit about Matthew. So Matthew, let me hand it over to you to talk a little and then introduce your panel.
Great. Sarah, can you hear me fine?
I can, thank you, yes.
Okay, good. So welcome everyone to our panel on managing trade and communication surveillance in the new world of work. And we are going to focus a lot on the new world of work. So I'm going to ask our expert speakers to introduce themselves in a moment, but I want to remind everybody that you can ask questions and vote in poll questions. So you can ask your individual questions and vote in polls using the box to the right of the video. Before we begin, let me ask each of the panelists to give a short intro about themselves and your interest in regulatory change management. And then once we've done the intros, then we'll start with a poll question. So I'm going to start off and with Eddie, and then we'll move on to Yasmin and Stan and Julian. So Eddie, quick intro, thanks.
Excellent, Matthew, thank you. So my name is Eddie Cogan. I'm the former founder and CEO of Catellus. Catellus was an e-com surveillance technology in the market for 14 years, servicing both large banks, hedge funds, and various other financial services firms. We were acquired recently this year by ACA, so I'm now a partner with their heading up their surveillance, investigations, and archive practice. So very much looking forward to the discussion and hopefully contributing to it today.
Thank you. Yasmin?
Hey everyone, very happy to be here. So my name is Yasmin Lee. I lead up the risk surveillance function in EMEA for Macquarie Bank, and also the global lead for the commodity surveillance function.
Thanks. Stan?
Hey everybody, I'm Stan from Citadel Securities. I'm the head of America's supervision, and I'm also an adjunct law professor at Fordham Law School, where I teach a class on quant trading, market structure regulation, and risk management.
Great. And last but not least, Julian?
Hey guys, Julian Horke, head of risk controlling at Berenberg Capital Markets in the US. We're essentially like a full-fledged investment bank in the US with like quite a focus on European small caps, mid caps, and I oversee essentially like the whole risk department in the US.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, so before we start with our panelists, we're going to have a poll of participants. And for those of you who are joining us, you can see the poll. So I'll read out the questions. I'll read out the question and ask you to vote. So the question is, what are the biggest surveillance and monitoring challenges your compliance teams are having in today's working environment? And the choices are managing a more distributed monitoring and surveillance environment, increased difficulty in monitoring the use of personal or unmonitored devices, maintaining security in a wider environment, capturing and monitoring the right data from surveillance systems, or identifying and resolving alerts. So pretty specific stuff. So if everyone would vote while the audience is voting, I'm going to start with the first question to our panel. And then I think I'll go to Yasmin for a starting answer, but everybody join in. So thinking about the past year and the impact of extended remote working arrangements, what do you consider to be the top challenge for managing surveillance and monitoring? Yasmin?
Yes. So I think the top challenge for the industry as a whole is adapting to the new risk profiles that are introduced by hybrid working and remote working. The last 2 years, they've really accelerated the evolution in how we communicate with one another. So there's an increased use of chat systems, sometimes platforms that offer chat as a secondary function, and the voice and video conferencing technologies have all evolved. So the breadth of how we communicate has increased, which adds complexity in how and what we can monitor. The FCA in EMEA recently released a paper on their expectations as well on hybrid and remote working setups, which really reiterates the need for maintaining equivalence in the standards that we adhere to. And the onus is on the firms to prove that they have the proper and appropriate governance and oversight of the staff. And a key point is also to ensure that control functions remain effective and unhindered by the remote working setup. So I think this is going to add challenges and work to most firms in thinking about their operating models, about potential weaknesses in what we have as current controls, including surveillance controls. And so that as an industry, we can think about how we might enhance them, make them more effective and make them more efficient. So I think that's the top challenge, but obviously existing challenges pre-COVID are still with us. So ensuring we are prioritizing the right thing, that we are getting value for the costs that we're investing, ensuring data is dependable and the quality of data is good, and all whilst dealing with the constant challenges around false positives, which I'm sure most of us in this panel probably have experienced, costs that we have to deal with against our stakeholders, and the requirements to keep up with technology advancements. So things around AI, natural language processing, machine learning. So all of that, just ties in with our challenges over the past 2 years. So yeah, I don't think we'll be out of a job anytime soon.
Julian, did you have some thoughts on, what's the top challenge right now?
I think essentially like the ones that you read out with the polling questions. I mean, they're pretty much with what I saw like on a technical like nitty-gritty level in the last like 1 or 2 years. But like I think if you want to take a sort of like a step back, I think we saw like just tremendous like development on the technological side on the one hand side, but like really also like a shift in like how we work, right? I mean, like we are in the beginning of some sort of like evolution of or revolution almost of work, right? And if you think of like how we discussed it at the beginning of the pandemic, like, hey, whether we're gonna go back to normal or whether we are in a new work environment, etc. I think that the people that thought that we would like eventually go back were, I think, like very wrong, right? And I think it's the sort of like the real question is gonna be like how much more of remote work are we gonna like see, right? Because obviously I think like now 2 years into the pandemic, we all know that we're never gonna go back again. The question is like how fast are we gonna develop new remote work capabilities? How quickly are we, or how much more virtual offices are we gonna see, right? So I think in terms of like compliance, the only thing is it's only gonna get more, right? Like it's gonna get only more virtual. It's only gonna get more remotely. We'll see more and more technology. So I mean, think about the metaverse, right? Like that we just I think it was Facebook who announced it very, very famously a couple of days ago. So overall, I think like we need to sort of like shift as a like from a like I think we have to shift our thought a little bit away from these like tactical measures to more strategic measures, because if we do like sort of like tactical incremental changes to our processes, how we monitor and how we ensure sort of like a how do you say, like a frictionless market, a free market, I think we really have to think more strategically and change, not just like incremental changes on like technology, but really think of like a strategic perspective how to answer this new like new world of work we're living in now.
So that's great. Going to be a great lead into our next question, because our next two questions are about the non-technology response to surveillance, and then the next question after that is about the technology response. But I'm waiting for the poll results to come up. Here we go. Okay, so everybody can see on the screen, managing a more distributed monitoring and surveillance environment and increased difficulty in monitoring the use of personal or unmonitored devices are both leading. And it's interesting, I think the third thing, which is capturing and monitoring the right data, is a I would say persistent. It's been true from, for a long time. It's going to be true going forward, whatever the technology is. And Stan, I know you've made a number of comments about this when we were prepping for the call, but it's quite clear that people are worried about the more distributed environment and new devices. So no question about that. So let's move on to some practical thoughts about what we're going to do about that. So on our second question, we're talking about with remote working and hybrid environments coming into play, how do we adapt our approaches to managing surveillance? And, in last year in August, the SEC, reminded people that they had an obligation to supervise their personnel, including from remote locations and when they're using personnel devices, and that was in one of their risk alerts. So let's start not with technology, but with things like policies, procedures, lexicons, and Stan, maybe you could lead us off in terms of on those both strategic and non-technology things. What are some of the responses?
Yeah, sure. So I think the poll results are quite interesting. I wonder if 1 and 2 is ultimately getting at the same challenge, maybe even the same answer to begin with, which is, are we still really in a BCP mode, or is this the new normal, and for how long is that going to be? So, like Yasmin's response to the first question was spot on. In my opinion, I have the same response, which is it's the change in risk appetite, risk tolerance globally, right? That is the biggest challenge for how should people be dealing with certain problems that typically don't arise in a usual work environment as we used to know it. And it's really hard to tell what normal is anymore. And I think Julian's comments on some of the practicalities of going through these types of questions is extremely important and what every firm faces. So when I think about, let's say, the role of surveillance in this environment, I actually think that approach is too late, the same way that if we think about an organization traditionally and yet 100 policies, chances are if someone's a betting person, the BCP one was the one that was not really given as much love as the other ones. So it's a bit sudden. All of a sudden your BCP gets invoked, you look at it and you're like, isn't really that helpful in dealing with the circumstance. Now, the circumstance was something that the world hasn't seen for a very, very long time. So in all fairness, how well that could have prepared for it is a separate question. But at the end of the day, you look at this document, you're like, what are we supposed to do? Right. So you're a bit unprepared from that standpoint. You look at your other policies and procedures and, you have this kind of lingering theme that you have to address in all these other contexts of, do people even have the same setup they have at home that they used to use in the office? If someone's trading and they have 4 screens to help on visibility and risk management and alerting to see everything going off, do you actually replicate that same environment at home to have that same risk assurance, right? If that is one of your controls. And from a policy procedure perspective, people being alert and responding to things occurring, i.e. incident response, very likely is built in there already. So I think you have to analyze all of your policies and procedures, again, from these 2 lenses of what was normal or what maybe still is normal, and then what is like that BCP mode that we may be persisting in for, let's say, another year or 2, hopefully not as long as that, but I think you have to have kind of left brain, right brain, analyzing it from both of those perspectives.
Great. And Yasmin, did you want to, you highlighted the same issues that the poll brought up, and what is the new normal, as Stan was explaining. Yeah. So, thoughts about the non-technology part of response?
Yeah, I agree with what Stan says. It's about understanding how your policies may need to be refreshed in light of the new environment, but also training might need to be re-looked at. Are you training people the right way? Is the information, do you need to highlight other aspects of training as a result of the new remote working conditions? Market abuse risk assessments as well. So I feel like those are probably the 3 artifacts that you probably want to look at and revisit in this new light. And to tie in what Julia mentioned earlier, understanding what enhancements could be quick wins to your current controls and policies versus building something a bit more strategic for the future. One thing I know is pretty unloved in this space is trade reconstructions, but we found them to be extremely valuable, especially in understanding the business and how they operate in a new environment. So taking a trade, tracing it back to origin, really understanding what led to the decision for a certain execution of transaction to be undertaken. So I think those are kind of some of the key points that we can do outside of the technology space.
Great. So
one thing I'd add on to what Yasmin said too, which I think is an important point, like regarding the use of training, because as I was mentioning, like if you look at BCP as kind of being one of the policies that we're too late to really proactively think about, I think the same thing applies to surveillance in this regard. Like if you're focusing all your attention on surveillance, you're really, I think, later to the game. You're trying to find problems at that point, but why don't you focus on preventing the problems? And the right way to do that for any employee is actually them joining the firm. And in a remote working environment where they might still not be in the office, that creates way more challenges. It's harder to actually deliver content in a virtual setting on very complex topics for someone that just arrived. And you also don't know like their prior firm's experience, whether they were good at training, whether they did any type of training, even if they did training, how consistent is that with your firm, which could be quite nuanced in a lot of areas. And so the more attention that's given upfront and actually just spending time with people and having that one-on-one conversation, the better it's going to be. And I think that actually is going to help a lot from the surveillance side when it comes to data privacy and just the general ethical concerns around it, because then it really has more to do with just trying to focus on a catch-all of problems as opposed to just reading people's messages all day for whatever reasons people have to do that.
I really like what you said about the onboarding process, etc. And like at the end of the day, like I think we mustn't forget that we're dealing here with people, right? And if you're sitting at home and like your dog is barking and maybe you have a toddler, etc., like you might not, and I mean that's just how it is, right? Like you might not be able to keep up the same professional level as you might like show the same professional demeanor as you would show in an office. And I mean, a lot of these like compliance issues are often like not coming from like intentional behavior, but really like a lack of professionalism, which might like often or which is certainly harder to ensure when you work from home or when people are working from home.
Yeah, I think one more thing there, Matthew, is a point that both Stan and Yasmin made is training. And I think one of the things we've seen over the last couple of years, and it's been made more and more possible because of NLP machine learning, you're able to craft policy better, but it's the, we all talk about uncovering the smoking gun, but uncovering the leading indicators of risk. The times when people, like Julian said, they forget they're at home and they cross the white line, and being able to say, we have a policy, we have a control. I think the way you approached it this time wasn't the right way, and having a teaching moment. And that allows a very concrete way of maybe compliance surveillance, communicating with somebody, putting them back on track and making them not feel so remote from the office. That would have been much more easy in the office. Now it's a little harder. So creating these training moments by uncovering risk before, just as it emerges. So in a sense, having policies from a tech perspective that look for things that are maybe wouldn't before have been wordy, right? But now could be useful in this remote working environment.
Well, it's the comments that everybody made, I think, lead very naturally to a question that was raised by someone on the event. And they wrote, how do you see the role of the compliance professional evolving? What skills and capabilities will they need as we start to use more technology to monitor behaviors? But I think I want to put the question slightly differently, was it's not just about using more technology to monitor. It's what I'm hearing from you guys is the environment's changing, business normal is what's normal is changing. You've raised a lot of issues. So, okay, we've talked about policies, procedures, we'll talk about technology, but what about the compliance officer? What about you guys and the people who you work with and who work for you? I think that's an interesting one. Julian, you have some thoughts about that? I think everybody should weigh in on this one.
I think we like. I would like to go back to the point that I said at the beginning. I think it's important to understand that, at least from my perspective, like we are in, like we are not gonna go back. We are in the beginning of like a shift of how we understand work, and I think like that with this like incremental technological changes in a firm, we are not gonna catch the dramatic shift that we are seeing right now happening with everything moving virtually. So I think it's from a skill set, in terms of skill set, I think we need a little bit of like people that are able to deploy visions and understand like, hey, if like we need to like really like rethink how we build compliance, I think frameworks.
Yeah. Yasmin, thoughts about changing what you guys have to be good at?
I think with the rise of electronic trading and the marketplace itself, I feel like compliance and surveillance analysts in general do need to be a bit more tech savvy than probably how we had operated historically. So much of what we do depends on technology and understanding the impact of those technologies on marketplaces, and the ability to tie multiple sources of data points together. And that natural inquisitiveness, I think, is something that's very important. But yeah, I think the key change is probably the adoption and basically embracing technology to do what we can as effectively as we can. With the rise in electronic trading, with algo trading especially, the amount of data that we're now expected to trawl through is huge. And therefore we do need to depend on technology, but more importantly, understand the technology so we also know the strengths and weaknesses of what we're conducting. So the explainability aspect becomes quite important too.
So it's a great segue into our next question. I'll go to Eddie. So we're talking about, there's been changes in technology that, Yasmin cited the changes in all the platforms that people are using to trade, but there's also the changes that we've heard about platforms that people are using to communicate. And then obviously they're not separate things, because every platform provider wants to drive people into their ecosystem and provide communication tools, and it just becomes one giant ball of communication. So from a surveillance and a monitoring point of view, how is Regtech keeping up with those changes?
Yeah. I think to touch on that one and to segue from the conversations we've had so far, Julian talking about a more strategic approach to it, Yasmin talking about the value of trade reconstruction, right? And the thing I'm thinking here is, and we're going to talk about later, holistic surveillance. I think not only the compliance officers maybe need to be more tech savvy, but also technology needs to be more friendly. In other words, the whole idea of the new concept of platforms and applications are easier to use, more intuitive, more obvious, more connected, requiring less training to use. I mean, one of the reasons why we decided to tie in with ACA is, they have trade, they have employee surveillance, they have trade surveillance, they've got market review, they got expert networks, and there will still be a multi-vendor environment, don't get me wrong, but I think we have to get to the point where, whether it's one vendor or multiple vendors, that the compliance officer has a screen and things are presented in context. You have this email review, you have these trades over here, you have employee over here, your control room here. I think we have to begin to make it easier for compliance people to see what's going on. And I think Yasmin's point of trade reconstruction being very, very valuable is an indication of how easier life would be if things are brought together. So I think from a tech perspective, we have to be driving towards making our technology easier to understand, easier to use, right? So that's just kind of following on from the previous conversation. But I think in terms of like the incremental, like we're now using WeChat and WhatsApp. Technically, just to answer your question, we can capture them. We can ingest them. We can associate that person with their Bloomberg, their Symphony, so we can make it, who are you? So we know that when you jump from email to WhatsApp, we can track you, we can present you in context. That's there right now. And of course, voice can be added into that. But once you add in voice, once you add in mobile capture, these are expensive pieces, right? So, and the price will come down, but for example, we still sell voice transcription by the hour, right? We're not still saying all you can eat. So the models have to change, but also I think these technologies are available, but they're somewhat expensive. So maybe you have to decide where you want to use them. It's a risk-based approach. In other words, here, these people are critical. I need to surveil these people, but not everybody. And as it becomes more pervasive, I would expect pricing to come down. But so maybe just kind of pause there and answer your question. But I think it's technically available. I think it's a question of deciding it's not an all or nothing. And maybe with mobile and capture of that nature, you decide who's most risky and start there, perhaps.
So that's a great answer. And we've got a question that we're going to get to. So the question was, how long do you think before the use of AI and machine learning tools go from a desire of firms to a regulatory expectation? So we're definitely going to come to that. But I think I want to skip the next question, which was more about the proliferation of collaboration platforms, because I think we've touched on that a lot, and jump to the questions about holistic, and are we there, and what are we doing? And then on to the questions about false positives and whether or not AI and machine learning are really being used. Because when we did our prep session for this, there was a lot of good conversation about that. So I really I really think we should talk about those things. I'll start with Julian if you want, but everybody should pile in on these two questions about holistic and what is ML really doing. So
I think on the holistic approach, I mean, we heard it before. I mean, like incorporating more and more sources and more, like for example, the telecommunication channels. This is something that we are doing right now, right? I mean, like it is a little bit like you're running always after the business, right? I mean, they are from a technological perspective always like a little bit faster, and like usually like on the compliance side, you're like one step behind, which is okay, you know, like we don't want to turn it around, right? But like so from a holistic perspective, I think including more and more data sources, giving a whole picture. For example, like with nice dashboards where the compliance folks can easily like see, okay, what is going on across like the different areas, right? So I think this is a great way to include like this concept of holistic surveillance in there, right? I think what I found particularly interesting is how do we handle like more and more communication platforms, because I just think about my own behavior. I mean, like I'm using, I guess like 10 different chatting apps. You know, the question starts like, where do we, like, how can we make sure that like all of these things are covered?
And Stan, I want to go to you because I know you have given a lot of thought to, well, there's all this data out there, but what about quality? Well, you know, how useful is it? Which is a big part of considering the value of holistic surveillance. So I'd love to hear from you on this.
Sure. Yeah, Eddie and I were laughing about this earlier, like in the prep channel. I said we could just have a conference based off of Eddie's experience over 14 years going through this before Regtech even existed. And I was just thinking about like his previous answer there, which is probably one of the only few vendors that say, let's make it friendly first. Right.
Yeah.
As opposed to being like, I have the super great technology, just make it live. Right. The same way that some people think, let's just launch the cars in the city. They're self-driving. It'll be fine. Right. Not realizing there are many, many questions to answer. And so a lot of times, I think with the build of technology, particularly the hype of AI, NLP, ML, things of that nature, it turns into what's called like what I call the IKEA model, which is you walk into IKEA, they have such a beautiful kitchen there, but then you realize that when you buy it, you actually have to assemble all of it yourself. And, it seems like it's only going to be 50 pieces, but it turns out to be 500. And going through that assembly process is by no means easy at all, with very little room for error, right? So a lot of times, I think the technology engagements here, or the deployment, the purchase of these platforms, especially when they try to solve many, many problems, doesn't really have a very strategic approach. I think, as Julian was saying before, it's kind of like, let's just get it and we'll figure it out along the way. Not realizing that the figure it out along the way approach, like if you start generating alerts, you now have a responsibility to monitor them. If they're all false positives, you still don't monitor them, the regulator can come in and be like, hey, you didn't perform this to what your policies and procedures say. And certainly, God forbid, there is one true positive in a sea of all these false positives, right? So you actually create a problem for yourself by the very nature of just kind of pursuing this because it's the next best thing. In the meantime, there are a lot of just very foundational problems just from the very basics with some of these algorithms that are deployed. Like, for example, what happens when you have someone in the firm with the same name? You have two people with the same name. Some algorithmic designs can be, hey, that's a duplicate. I don't want to have duplicate information. Ignore the other one. The right thing to do is to be like, hey, we have this situation, alert it to a human for them to make a decision. And a human's like, hey, it's very possible for people to have multiple names, right? So the latter approach is safe, and the right approach, the former approach, can result in a failure to supervise for, as a result, excluding all the records of the other John Smith duplicate person, right? These are the kinds of things that probably aren't really thought through and are one of those, like, we'll get to it when it occurs, but by the time it occurs, we mentioned this right at the very beginning, it's too late, right? So I think taking a much more proactive and strategic approach and really understanding what is the problem that you're trying to solve, because this idea of holistic, if you think about it, it's saying, hey, we can solve 10 problems for you. But the real question is, the problem you're trying to solve is, in effect, regulatory safety, assurance. And you want to be very careful that each of the solutions offered, let's say by one provider to the extent that even exists, actually addresses that problem independently in that vertical to 100% satisfaction, or whatever the risk tolerance is for the firm, right? You don't want a situation where like your trade surveillance platform is 100% effective, and then your expert network monitoring platform is 10% effective, when one of the biggest risks for your firm might be insider trading, right? So I think taking a very strategic approach and emphasizing data quality and just foundational aspects of what are we trying to solve here, right? And can this scale? Can this work globally? Because we might have this problem globally. Those are the types of questions that need to be had at the forefront before jumping into a lot of these solutions.
And Eddie, what have you seen from you've talked about how your firm, your combined firms can facilitate the ingestion and analysis of many, many different data sources.
Yeah.
But to Stan's point, in terms of effectively solving the risk management problems across those different types of sources, what's your experience in terms of where the industry is?
I think this is a brilliant question. I mean, I love Stan's IKEA analogy, because also not only do you realize that some bits are missing and you have extra screws, but when you put it in your kitchen, you realize your kitchen needs replacing, because it's the only good thing in your kitchen now, because so suddenly you got knock-on effects, right? So but I think it comes back to, I love the question of from a risk perspective, because let's say you put in some machine learning or whatever technology behind that, and you remove 90% of your false positives. Well, how do you audit that? Right? How do you demonstrate that there is not true positives in there? And what technology did you use to get there? Because, for example, the security services can use all kinds of technologies to find, the terrorist, but you need to be able to demonstrate how you went from 100 million people to 1. You need to be able to explain it. So, and we talk about AI and machine learning. There are many different types of machine learning out there. For example, there's model-based machine learning where you take 10,000 examples and you learn something. Great for language detection, because you know what? I have 100,000 examples of French language. Easy for me to train many models across 50 languages. But you ask me to do within insider trading, there might be 100 different ways that can manifest itself, but I may have 2 examples. So for that, we prefer NLP machine learning, because I can be very, like I often describe it as, I can have an orchestra of violins and they're all working perfectly. And then I realize, one needs adjusting, and I adjust the violin, I tune it better, and I can get it working now. If that was one model and I made one adjustment, the whole model needs now to go through audit. So your time to market for one small change could be 6 months. The problem with that is the guy who recommended the change doesn't know whether that was even going to work. So you can't test it easily. So, or if you test it in one environment, you put it in elsewhere, it might impact the overall model. So in a sense, the different AI technologies you use matter. And also, I think different technologies have application in different areas. So for example, like the model is really, really good for when you have a large number of examples. I think NLP, machine learning, is good for definition of risk. And there are different permutations of that when you want to define context. For example, expert networks, watch lists, restricted lists, you have a bunch of keywords, right? You need to find this security, and you should have a security master, because the security can manifest itself in a number of ways. Well, then you need to define context, because I only care about it in certain contexts. It's only a risk in certain contexts. So then you might want to do training with lots of content, not a lot of volume of content, but more words, right? So without going down that rat hole, I think my 2 points are, there's a lot of marketing around machine learning. I think it's very important to know how whatever machine learning you use, how does it work? Can you explain it? Can you defend it? And can you audit it? Can you demonstrate to a regulator, when I removed 500,000 false positives every day, that there were no true positives in there? I know how I got there. I know what I used to get there. And is it consistent day in, day out, right? So I think all these things are back to the IKEA model, is when you assemble the technology to solve your real problem, your risk, you need to know, it needs to come together properly. You need to have no bits left over, and it needs to fit into the environment with which it is. So I think when we approach it, I mean, the strength of ACA is they're primarily compliance people. 90% of the firm is compliance. So that rigor, I mean, we already had it from the point of view that we have like 5 different types of machine learning in the tool, because each different way needs a different tool to work properly to solve the problem. So we're problem-centric, not technology-centric. In other words, we're not saying we got a great tech and you should use it that way. So I think when coming back to the compliance person's problem, I think you've got to, whatever tech you use, it doesn't matter. You must be able to audit it. When you make a change, you must be able to test it. You must be able to know the impact to your model immediately. So your time to market is quick, not 6 months. And it must fit into the vision, to Julian's point, of where you want to go with this, right? Because there are proliferation of platforms. There are proliferation of ways of communicating. And when you bring them together, you can't, for example, have a chat room and have one message which is a hit and don't have the rest of the chat. And often when I chat with one person, I'm in another chat room with another person, and it's kind of like overlapping conversations. Can I join them together? Maybe I'm selling here and I'm buying here. So this joining is really, really important. This context is really, really important. And the IKEA model is you definitely want to try and get to the beautiful table you saw in the IKEA showroom. But you've got to make sure you understand how to get from A to B, because I think, it's powerful, it can work, but it's important to, know your steps, right? Know your steps.
Well, I think we've got a perfect time now to segue, and I want to start with Yasmin into, okay, AI, machine learning. What people want to know, I think, are 2 questions. One, who's using it and what are they really doing with it? And how are the regulators viewing it from an acceptability point of view? And what are the challenges to achieving both those things? And Yasmin, I think you've got some really interesting insights to that.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. I think in line with what Eddie was mentioning about different types of machine learning and AI, and I think that's very true in this space. I feel that in industry, NLP, or natural language processing, is more widely accepted as a way forward, and that it always comes down to prioritization. For your machine learning models to be effective, you need to train them, and training them, as mentioned, could involve analysts potentially sifting through information to identify where the true positives are. So natural language processing, that's evolved, I think, in line with just commercial usage of things like Alexa, Siri that we use in our everyday life. So I feel like natural language processing is very natural to also develop in industry. However, in, I would say, trade surveillance or surveillance outside of the e-coms and voice space, I'm not sure how many of us have actually gone beyond a proof of concept. So I'm part of a surveillance network based in London, and I think in terms of the intel and insights gathered there, I mean, most places they're testing it out. They might be running some sort of machine learning or AI model in parallel to their rules-based engines, but don't believe anyone has fully turned off their rules-based engine rules as of yet. And I think that ties in exactly what we mentioned around the explainability piece. How do we convince the regulators that we have our machine learning tools configured to the right tolerance and in line with our risk tolerance that we want to maintain? And one of the challenges itself, I mean, I'm sure you guys have regulator or exchange inquiries. One of the key questions is, for this specific incident, did you detect it? And if you didn't detect it, why? And with a rules-based engine, it's quite easy to answer those questions. My tolerance was set at this is why it wasn't flagged, or, we felt that this tolerance should have been here, and that's why it didn't flag. And I think it's going to be a lot harder to answer those questions going forwards, should it be a pure machine learning AI type model. And sadly, the more we want explainability, I think the less we benefit from some of those deep learning AI machine learning techniques. So there's a bit counterintuitive there.
Yeah, absolutely. And from the US perspective, so that's great. And it's really interesting to hear how the industry's coming together and where the regulators are. Stan and Julian, your perspective on ML and what people are using it for, and is it really diminishing false positives, and are we ready to present it to the regulators? So why don't we start with Stan and get Julian, and then we'll wrap up in the next 3 minutes.
I see some of the more applicable, like helpful use cases in the realm of if you're doing, let's say, trade surveillance, as Yasmin was saying before, incorporating outside information such as news and scraping things like Twitter, just to give you better context for what may be going on in an objective, like public domain that may influence someone's decision to engage in a transaction or not. And that tends to be more helpful too, because you're really facilitating as opposed to like making a determination. Like the second that you're using this technology, these techniques, I should say, to make a determination, it's a much more tricky engagement. And you should ask yourself, like, is this really the best way of approaching this problem? Because often it's not, and we're still in a very experimental mode. And I think you see consistency in this from even SEC speeches by, I think, Scott Blodgett. He used to be the head of Division Economic Risk Analysis previously. And in that speech, he gives examples of where NLP is utilized. And there's some interesting use cases, but I think probably the key thing here is that these still tend to be on the experimental stage and seeing what we're coming up with. And of course, in speeches or even these types of discussions, you often hear some things we found. You don't hear about the hours and hours and hours it took to get to this point, right? And particularly since the beginning of this session, we talked about having to figure out strategically how you're operating in this type of BCP or possibly new normal. Like, I think there's, engaging down these experimental journeys takes an extraordinary amount of time that probably does not outweigh all of the other tasks you really should be doing as part of just being in this new normal. So I think generally speaking, we see some experimentation with this in the US, but that's the level that it's really at. And I think it tends to more be focused around facilitating decision-making opposed to making decision-making.
Great. So we've got 1 minute left. Julian, if you've got 30 seconds before I hand over to Sarah again, comments?
I can pretty much what Stan said, resonates a lot. I think we are at the beginning, we use it already to some extent, especially AML space, also natural language processing, etc. And I think also to Jasmine's point, we have the issue around regulatory issues that to some extent the technology is further ahead than what we are allowed to some extent to do, because of we cannot explain to some extent what these models do, or maybe we cannot validate them. So I think that's
great.
Pretty much from my side.
Okay, I'll hand back over to Sarah. So thanks very much.
Thank you indeed, Mark, and the panel for sharing your expertise and experience of trade and communication surveillance in our new working environment. Also, an interesting conversation on the potential of AI and ML, which I feel sure. Thanks again for your time and for joining us today. That's our last session for today and this week's Regtech Summit Virtual. Thank you to our speakers and our sponsors. Our platinum sponsors, Bureau van Dijk, a Moody's Analytics company, IHS Markit, Luxoft, and Univista, an LSEG business. And our gold sponsors, ACA Group and the Derivatives. Please complete the delegate feedback form because your feedback is important for the future development of our events. If you've missed any sessions from yesterday or today, they're available on demand for a limited time. Also, don't forget to sign up for upcoming Regtech Insight webinars and events and so on, all on the Regtech Insight web pages or on our A-Team Insight website. We'll be back next year with these in-person Regtech summits in London, New York, and Asia Pacific. We'll have more information on these for you soon. Meantime, thank you very much indeed for watching, and goodbye.